Max, good to see you again. It's been way too long. How you doing?
Yeah, really well, man. Thanks for the invite again. And yes, it's been way too long. But I just keep listening to your shows and you keep crushing it. So it feels like yesterday, man.
Well, thank you. I think we spoke offline maybe last fall, but I didn't check when the last time I had you on the pod was. But Bitcoin years always feel Bitcoin kind of warps time, so I'm not sure if it makes time seem like less time has elapsed or more. But in any case, it feels like it's been way too long since you've been on. So I thought it would be great to catch up today, have you on, and also I've been kind of away from things generally. I mean, I still do the podcast, but a lot of the shows I do these days are just with random Bitcoiners out in the wild, no specific topic. And I've been kind of heads down writing a book. And so I'm kind of out of the loop on a lot of things, but definitely out of the loop on what's going on in privacy land. So I thought the combination of those two things was reason enough to have you on for a chat.
Yeah, for sure, man. It's good that you have these pleb talks. Like seriously, I'm always staggered by the quality and the quantity of the Bitcoiners that are around. And it's just really nice to have a show like yours that dives deep with the people that you don't usually hear about, because they're really fascinating people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have this thing now where I put a public Calendly link on, so people can now just book themselves into the show. And I have a little write up, and if people are clearly like either shitcoiners or massive self promoters, then I don't put them on. I don't we don't set up the show. But most of the time, they're just humble Bitcoiners out in the wild that want to come on and just have a chat, basically. And as you say, it's not surprising at this point, but it's really nice to see the quality of people that are out there. People are thoughtful, humble, respectful, principled, value-oriented, driven, very much committed to the cause.
That's what freedom does to people. Crazy,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's the most inspiring thing, right? And so, I've been really enjoying it. But why don't you tell me what's new in your world? I've been heads down on a book. What have you been heads down on?
Fixing Bitcoin, as we all are trying to do. So privacy obviously is the first and the biggest critique with Bitcoin, right? The two things: privacy sucks and scalability is non-existent, and the two of them are pretty closely relied, right? Because the reason why Bitcoin doesn't scale is the same reason why it's not private, because everyone has to verify every transaction of everyone else. That's both a privacy and a scalability nightmare, right? And that's why this was the very first and very obvious critique to Satoshi publishing the white paper. And his answer is like, yeah, good luck figuring out a better solution. And more than a decade later, we still haven't. So Bitcoin, with its existing set of rules, does a lot of things really, really, really well. And in hindsight, even the privacy part of it, like Satoshi didn't even fuck up that. Like it's really great to use. Like you can use Bitcoin anonymously, very much like today, and in fact, since basically always it was possible. We just didn't know how to do it. We were a bit stupid and naive and made very bad mistakes in using this genius protocol. And then we
you mean with like KYC on ramps and stuff like that?
Yeah, KYC on ramps. That's a big one. But just things like address reuse. Like who ever thought that would have been a good idea, right? But if you want to build a Bitcoin wallet as easy as possible, address reuse. Like as soon as you start looking into not reusing addresses and using a new private key and public key for each payment, all of the headaches start. Like everything gets so much more complicated. So the quick and easy path, that was not anonymous, and yeah, people complained about that. But it's so cool, right? That we don't have to change the protocol one bit to make it work really privately. We can change the protocol to make the privacy faster and cheaper and more secure. And thankfully, we've been doing this for a long time with Softforks like SegWit or Taproot. Massive privacy and scalability improvements that we have discovered after Satoshi pushed the Genesis version, right? But But even without of that, a lot of the problems of Bitcoin can be fixed client side and not on a protocol level. And that is really, really encouraging. You know, you don't need to mess with the rules of someone else to use the system in a way that you want it to use. And that's just super great, right? That shows what's possible with anarchy when you don't have to mess with the rules of others, when you can just peacefully coexist with other people, and you mind your own business and they mind theirs, and it just all works out quite beautifully.
Right. And I guess you both subject yourselves to a set of rules, but there's wiggle room for how you engage those rules, or which ones you most subject yourself to. Or, you know, maybe this is probably getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but you bring up Taproot, and you bring up, you know, not having to make changes to the base layer, and, you know, making changes or developing on the client side, let's say. What do you make? And of course, we had the whole ordinal and inscription phenomenon happen in this year, basically. And, you know, when that happened, part of what I thought was how it, you know, what it meant for you guys in terms of the cost of block space and that kind of stuff. So why don't we break into that right now? And I guess just to start, one, you know, now that Taproot's a done deal and we're experiencing some of the effects or outcomes of it, what are your thoughts on it? And then to your point about not having to change the base layer and doing things client side, how, if at all, has the experience of Taproot changed your view of how we should be looking at changes to the base layer, or upgrades to the base layer, like soft forks, let's say? Because, you know, one of the things I've been discussing a little bit on the pod over the last year has just been, I feel like not enough people have a sufficient framework to assess upgrades to Bitcoin. And so what ends up happening is everyone just kind of defers to like the same group of 20 or 30 so-called experts who are typically very technically inclined, perhaps far less so economically or, you know, otherwise. And that doesn't seem like a very good basis upon which to make judgments for oneself on what code they wish to run. You know, just deferring to experts, and if everyone gives a stamp of approval, then I guess it's a good thing. It seems to me that that's way too willy-nilly, and that we should all have a better perspective or framework, you know, for assessing potential changes and the risks and the benefits and how to balance the two. So what is your perspective on that issue broadly, and then in relation to the experience with Taproot?
Yeah, I really got to love Bitcoin with the changes to the protocol. SegWit and UASF and No2x, that entire drama turned me into the hardcore Bitcoiner that I am now, right? So what happened there? I mean, I say Bitcoin is perfect, right? But it's not, man. It's so shitty, bro. If you look closely, Bitcoin is a debacle and nightmare and absolute disaster. And there's actually things that we really, really have to fix in the protocol, like many, right?
We'll touch on those later.
Yeah, like so you know, segregated witness, that was such a huge thing, right? There was this massive problem, right? That you have a transaction with inputs and outputs, you sign with the private key of the input to authorize the transaction to happening, and then we have a final transaction, right? Which includes inputs, outputs, and signatures fundamentally, and a transaction header, which basically commits to everything, all of these inputs and outputs and signatures. And one of the core problems of Bitcoin was that you could change the content of the signature, right? You literally flip a 0 to a 1, right? And you can change that without knowing the private key, right? So an outside observer who sees your signature on a transaction, he can literally change that transaction. It's cryptographically still a valid transaction, right? But the transaction hash, the transaction ID will have changed, because as soon as you flip one bit in the input to a hash function, the output is 100% randomly indistinguishably different. And that means that everything was a headache. Like just running a Bitcoin full node was a mess, because you have a transaction and it gets broadcasted through the Bitcoin network, and and one person can change a bit of the signature and broadcast a transaction that looks as if it is new, but in fact it's the same transaction. And so that was basically a denial of service attack that was executed and attacked on Bitcoin nodes numerous times, and businesses lost money because they thought that they received a transaction and then forgot or lost track of it, etc. Massive nightmare. And on top of that, all of these cool ideas that we had, like the Lightning Network or like Coinjoins, or vault constructions, all of these depend that the transaction ID and that it doesn't change. Right. So just to sum up, there was a massive problem with this transaction malleability or signature malleability in the Bitcoin protocol, and it made a lot of things really difficult. Not impossible, just really difficult. And so ultimately, we needed to fix that. But how do you fix the plane as it's flying, right? Especially if you can't break the rules of anyone else. So we come up with this cool way of literally segregating the witness, right? Segregating the signature to not be part of to be included in the transaction hash. So basically, we want a way that even if you would change the signature and make it malleable, basically, the transaction hash would be unaffected. That's the gist of segregated witness and why it's so important. The huge problem was, how are we going to force everyone to change the rules that way? And for a long time, it seemed the only way possible was to break the rules and set a new set of rules. And it only works if everyone upgrades to this new set of rules. Well, because Bitcoin is run on hundreds of thousands of computers by individuals that don't talk to each other on this level of the protocol, and with not a single trusted third party in the middle to coordinate or even announce how exactly we're going to change the rules, it's basically impossible. Then this anonymous contributor out of cyberspace just appeared. Shaolin Fry was his name, whoever that was. Thanks Satoshi for him. He found a way to introduce segregated witness without breaking the rules of old existing nodes. And that was a soft fork, right? To make sure that these new types of transactions are valid, right? And that new updated nodes will verify that still all the signatures, all the transaction hashes, etc., are valid. But that requires the new set of rules, right? So only if you upgrade your node can you truly and fully validate this new SegWit transaction. But if you're an old node, not having upgraded because you don't want to, or you didn't know that there was an upgrade, or you didn't know which upgrade to do, you were still in consensus with everyone else. You were still part of the longest proof of work chain, and we did not have a fork of the protocol into two different sets of users with two different sets of changes and transactions that are valid. And so this basically meant to me that when there is something that we really need and want to change, we can change that, and the benefits of the change will be available to the people who upgrade. And if you run a SegWit node, you get all the benefits of SegWit, right? Which is a fixed transaction malleability, a slight block space increase, things like Coinjoins and Lightning Network being a lot more practical. All of this is possible just if you upgrade and the people whom you work with upgrade. But if there is a couple, old Luddites who don't want to upgrade, you don't have to. You don't have to convince them to upgrade. You still get all of the benefits from the improved set of rules without violating the rules of someone else. This was UASF, right? And then on top of that, that nobody, not even the miners, can prevent you from creating a part of the network that has this new set of rules. Right? That's the user-activated soft fork. We don't need the miners' permission to improve the set of rules that we have, right? Because miners are our customers. We pay the miners in order to produce valid blocks. And if miners produce invalid blocks to our set of rules, well, we don't pay them. And therefore, the node operator, the merchant who runs this Bitcoin full node in order to accept money in exchange for goods and services, he is the king of the system, right? Once I realized that, I was like, holy shit, we can actually fix all of the many flaws of Bitcoin without violating the core ethical set of rules of the consensus system. And not just the ethical rules, but the technical realities of upgrading the system. And like, even if it were okay to force everyone to upgrade on an ethical point of view, how are you going to manage that? right? Because some people just might be running the software on a computer that they lost access to, for example. So what are you going to do about that? There's literally nothing that you can do to force people to install software on their computer other than hacking their machine, which for other reasons is just difficult and not practical. So SegWit made it possible to upgrade the system and be useful, even just if it's the minority of users. But then simultaneously, there was No2X, right? Which was basically a separate small group of engineers tried to hard fork the system, right? To violate old existing set of rules, like increasing the block space in a very naive way. That was impossible, right? There were numerous attempts at hard forking the Bitcoin consensus rule, and none of them succeeded to convince my node into accepting these blocks that I did not approve of, with the rules that I did not approve of. So it was literally impossible for anyone, after numerous attempts by extremely well-funded people and very dedicated people, to force me to change my rules if I don't see it fit. And that's just so staggering, right? That not just can we improve the system in a way that we don't mess with someone else, but that if someone, even the most well-funded attackers, basically, try to force you to change the system, if you don't upgrade, they have nothing over you, and they will just fork off, create their own shitcoin that nobody cares about, because the default and the consensus matters an extreme amount. And so SegWit really was that point where I was like, wow, this works, and we can fix the critical things if we're smart about how to fix them.
Yeah. And so how do you apply that to future changes? Because, presumably perhaps this is the question, what risks come with making any of those changes, even if they are backwards compatible, even if they are, highly spec'd out and reviewed and all that kind of stuff? What are the risks to making changes in the manner of a soft fork? And with specifically to Taproot, what is your impression of how that went down and what the effects have been?
Yeah, I think Adam Back said this really well, apparently discovered that in 2013 or something, that if you try to change any little thing about Bitcoin, it tends to get worse, not better. Like Bitcoin is kind of in this lucky, optimum, that if you change a little thing, there's a huge trade-off that comes. Maybe you improve one thing, but you might make some other things quite a lot worse. SegWit is a perfect example, actually. Like the benefits of it are obvious, right? We fix transaction malleability, we increase the block size, we bring scalability and privacy and make it doable on the Bitcoin base layer. Awesome. But good luck trying to understand the SegWit rules fully and truly, especially the user activated software part. The level of weird things that we had to introduce to make that work are pretty bad. Like, if we could have just broken the rules, in fact, if we can break not just the SegWit rules, but multiple set of rules, we can change Bitcoin substantially and make it a lot more elegant. Like SegWit, in the way it was introduced, was just so weird. So many quirks got introduced, and it makes it just so much more difficult to reason about the protocol. And that's not good, right? We want to have an elegant protocol, something that just makes sense and that fits together well. That's beautiful in the sense of everything that's there is there because it has to be. If we remove one thing, then it all falls apart. And with SegWit, we had to really get weird about a lot of things, like how we calculate the block size. That's now all of a sudden not trivial anymore at all. And the way that we serialize the transactions, etc., it's just super, super, super weird. So that is one of the many downsides, right? The system, even when we don't break old rules, or especially when we don't break old rules, it gets a lot more difficult to reason about the system, to make sure that it actually works, to build software that adheres to that protocol, and to make sure we don't fuck it up. Like, the more complex.
Sorry to interrupt, but are you saying with the benefit of hindsight, you would have liked to see SegWit be done differently, or are you just saying that it's necessarily the case that to turn this into, I guess, what it needs to be, or what we continue to evolve our own definition of what we want it to be, we have to get creative, and creativity is a chaos in a sense, and it introduces complexity, and that's just the nature of the beast, and it has to be done? Or you're saying in hindsight things could have been done more elegantly?
I'm not sure even if in hindsight it could have been done more elegantly, all things considered. Just because this is such a mess of a protocol and the coordination effort. So no, I think this is just the nature of the beast, right? When you cannot break the rules like ever, and you have to somehow find a way to wiggle your change to the rule sets through without violating the rules of other people. And that's still the case, right? And we will never able to fix that because that's just how Bitcoin works. And it's a good thing that Bitcoin works that way. So it's more like a feature than a bug. And it's an unfortunate feature though. And like in a perfect world, Bitcoin would be a lot simpler, but in a perfect world, we wouldn't need Bitcoin, right? Because there would be no uncertainty, right. no problem with trusting people, and we have abundant resources, etc. I mean, in a hypothetical La La Land, sure, like lots of things are different, but as you said earlier, like having a set of rules is great. It's like the rules that we play by. It's like gravity, and it's once we have a certain set of rules that we can. That we know, that we can anticipate, and that we can expect to be the same, then we can start building extremely beautiful and complex things on top of a simple set of rules. Right? Like a plane flies not despite of gravity, but because of it, and because of density of air, etc. And if we would change any small variables of our universe, let's say, like increase the gravity by a factor of 2 or whatever, well, the plane crashes and every house collapses and all humans die. So having a rigid set of rules that cannot be broken is quite beautiful, because it enables the mind of the engineer to come up with elegant solutions to the problems that we have in this given set of rules. And very often we can solve these problems without violating the rules. In fact, because the rules are there, we can solve the problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. If there was no rules, no laws, no forces, then everything would just be a giant blob of nothingness, and within the parameters and rules that we both involuntarily and voluntarily subject ourselves to, it's in between those limitations that creation is possible, and that complexity is possible, and that beauty is possible, and all those things that we elevate and we admire and praise and enjoy and everything. I mean, that's where the juice is. So I totally agree with that. And of course, agree with just what it is, or the hope for what the parameters that are represented in Bitcoin are capable of producing in that sense. But just to put a cherry, to tie a bow on this Taproot, this part of the discussion, what have been your impressions on that upgrade, its results or outcomes, and just general thoughts on it?
Yeah, but so I think SegWit and UASF really turned me into a Bitcoiner, and then with Taproot, like I was even more on the front lines of this whole thing happening, because there's this idea of a Coinjoin, which basically means a collaborative Bitcoin transaction. A Bitcoin transaction has inputs, the coins being spent, and outputs, the coins being received or generated. And usually, the way Satoshi described Bitcoin in the white paper was that if there are multiple inputs, they belong to the same person. Right? So one person puts together 5 coins that he received in 5 different times in the past with 5 different amounts in 5 different transactions. These inputs can be spent together. Which is a very practical way of doing it, right? Because then you have one person who creates this transaction and who verifies the transaction and who signs the transaction. And if you're alone, you're the dictator of your own kingdom, and there is very little problems with that. There are, however, privacy downsides to it, in the sense that now we know that these 5 coins from 5 different transactions in the past actually belong to the same person. And if you've generated a new address each time you receive money, at the point where you receive the money, it's not yet clear that these addresses belong to the same person, or that these coins belong to the same person. But when you spend them together in the same transaction at the same time, well, that usually just happens because all of these coins are yours. So we have a privacy problem. But there's an elegant solution to the privacy problem. Just don't be forever alone when you create a new transaction. Invite your friends to add inputs and outputs to a larger transaction. And so instead of every user buying his own transaction, hundreds of users get together to join in a single transaction. And all of a sudden, instead of 5 inputs, 2 outputs, for example, we have hundreds of inputs and hundreds of outputs, where there are hundreds of different users coming together to build this Bitcoin transaction, making it much more difficult to find out who has which inputs or how many inputs and which outputs, etc. And so the way that we have always done these Coinjoin transactions was that you needed to have the private keys on the computer that's connected to the internet, that has access to the blockchain, and that can verify a lot of things, right? Because that's just how we always had it implemented. In other words, signing a Coinjoin transaction with a hardware wallet was never even attempted for a long time, because it added a lot of complexities. And back in 2019, at a conference, I met with Slush and Stick from Trezor, and we had the initial ideas of, hey, how could we actually sign a Coinjoin transaction with the private keys on a hardware wallet? Right. So a hardware wallet is a tiny dedicated computer that is not connected to the internet, that does not have access to the Bitcoin block, that cannot verify the Bitcoin consensus rules. Right. So it's a very dumb machine, let's say, and because it's that dumb, it might make stupid mistakes. And, initially we thought back in 2019, oh yeah, easy. We'll just do it. Weekend project, hackathon, and done. We have it. But then thanks to Stepan Snegerov from Spectre Wallet, he discovered a serious attack vector that basically your hardware wallet can get tricked into sending money to an attacker without ever knowing about it. So basically someone can trick you into taking money out of your wallet. Without the hardware wallet being able to detect that this attack is happening and not being able to prevent it, therefore. And well, that was a big problem. And we didn't have a solution to this problem. Then we did some research on how to make sure that we fix this. And there were 2 parts to that solution. First, you need to prove a negative. You basically need to prove that all the other inputs in this transaction do not belong to you. If you know a bit about philosophy, proving a negative is a bit tricky. And thankfully, we figured out a way of doing it. I don't want to get too much into technicals. The second part of the problem was in a Bitcoin transaction with inputs and outputs. On the input side, there is no mention of how much value is in the input. If you look at a transaction and you see the input, it doesn't tell you if it's 100 Satoshis or 100 Bitcoin. And there is literally no value mentioned on the input side. And that's a problem. The reason why that is because of efficiency. Right? The value of the coin was already mentioned on the output side. On the input side, we just need to point to a specific coin saying, that's the coin I want to spend. And then I look in my database of the unspent transaction outputs, and there I will see how much value is in that coin. I don't need to write the value down twice. That's just wasting bandwidth and storage, basically. But the big problem is that if you don't know the value of the inputs, this attack that I mentioned, that someone might steal money out of your hardware wallet, is still possible. And there, if I remember that correctly, there was some attempt to fix this problem with SegWit, version 0 back in 2017. But then in hindsight, Stepan Snegerov and the Trezor researchers found out that, in fact, this was not fixed. The same problem still existed And it was still not possible to securely sign a multi-party transaction on an offline signing device, like a hardware wallet. And then what do we do, right? At this point, it's like, yeah, oh shit, we literally the protocol is broken in such a bad way that we cannot use it to satisfy this use case. And there was seemingly no way around it. So, well, either you give up and you have less security if you want to use Bitcoin anonymously, which is not really acceptable, right? You want to have the highest level of security while using Bitcoin as anonymously as is possible. And what you do, well, you try to change the rules, right? But changing the rules is not just extremely difficult, but it just is extremely difficult, like full stop, at that point in time, Taproot was under an active discussion and already actively being implemented in the Bitcoin Core software without yet being fully deployed. So thankfully, we were exactly at that point in time where we were researching of this topic, where at the same time the Bitcoin Core developers were working on fixing or creating Taproot as a change to the protocol rules. And we could notify the other Bitcoin developers about, hey, this is a serious problem, and we have an elegant solution to it, but we need to change the rules of the protocol to enable that. And thankfully, after even more review and research, this proposed change was adopted in the set of consensus rule changes that Taproot enabled, right? So with the Taproot upgrade, now the value of the input is committed to by the input. We still don't reference it, but at least there's a way to verify that this is actually the input with the value of the input while just looking at this one transaction and some metadata. And so this now, well, five years later, after we started the initial research in 2019, after finding critical security vulnerabilities and solutions to those security vulnerabilities, after coming up with a way to introduce or to introduce the solution into the Bitcoin consensus rules with the already being worked on Taproot upgrade, and then after finally getting consensus on how should Taproot be spec'd out, how should it be deployed, right? And then ultimately deploying it, only then, right, could we seriously work on making hardware wallet signing of Coinjoins possible, which we finally succeeded in this year. Like in March 2023, we signed the first Coinjoin multi-party Bitcoin transactions with the keys on a secure and offline signing device, and that's now shipped with Trezor Suite. And so it's not just Wasabi anymore that has the capability of making anonymous Bitcoin transactions. It's now the Trezor Suite as well. And even better, well, infinitely more security while having the private keys on an offline signing device. So this long rant is basically just about finishing the story of SegWit introduced me to Bitcoin as this beautiful system of a set of rules that cannot be broken, but that can be changed if you're smart about it. And then with Taproot, I really got firsthand experience of the feeling of realizing that what you want to do is not possible with the set of rules. But then after a shit ton of work, finding ways to actually manifest this, right? To change the rules of the protocol without violating the rules of anyone else. And then after that is possible to open up this incredible amount of extra room for activity in the sense of things that we can accomplish by using these sets of rules. So yeah, these two changes to the Bitcoin rules were, I mean, both have changed my life. Like literally, this is a really fascinating thing. So Taproot is magical. Like it really, really is. And I haven't even talked about the cool things about Taproot, right? Like this little part of Taproot was just something for this really niche case of collaborative Bitcoin transactions. Coinjoins, Lightning Network, splicing, or dual funding. Channel opens, by the way, are also affected by this attack. And so having the ability to adapt these set of rules is crazy. And the fact that like this random guy like me can make a meaningful impact on here is both kind of exhilarating, because who would have thought that you can be part of crafting the rules of the new monetary order for centuries to come, right? But simultaneously, like if an idiot like me can do this, then who else, right? And isn't that a massive glaring attack vector that just anyone can come and change rules, arguably on a whim? So yeah, this is wild. Like this is absolutely wild.
Well, that's part of the crux of my question. How does one assess the risks of these things, right? The benefits are well enough known, or they're easy enough to grasp. Someone says it's going to allow us to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, those are valuable functions. I want that to happen. Great. That would be useful. As you just said, nothing good comes without risks. Nothing good comes into the world without its kind of, flip side or downside. So what do you think the risks are of, again, upgrades in general? And as you just said, you used a perfect example. What do you think about that dynamic of someone like yourself? Now, of course, you're being humble, but like someone like yourself, being able to make changes.
Yeah, like, I was really involved with Taproot. I mean, I wrote a bachelor thesis on it, like, I mean, that's, I guess, as as a non-developer, as much as you could be involved. And I really try to understand it and see try to gouge out if it's a good thing or not. Yet still, after all of these, God knows how many hours of research, it never occurred to me that it would enable transactions the size of 4 megabytes, right? Like, I did not know. And sure, I'm not a developer to actually understand the lines of code being written. I didn't even look at them, to be honest, because that's not just my skill. But, even trying to research this on a high level basis, I just did not know that it's possible to create these huge 4 megabyte transactions while still being in the set of rules. Now, in hindsight, I've heard people like Andrew Polstra, etc., explain the reasons for why this is possible. And apparently they were thinking about these specific things and had good reasons for introducing these changes. But if me, after so much research, doesn't even know that this is on the table, that just really shows the unknown unknowns, right? I just didn't know. And yeah, that's scary, because what else don't I know, right? Even after all of this research. Right. And then it's like, you put yourself on the line as well, because I was really, really loud with activating Taproot. Because, I mean, look at it. It's fucking beautiful, right? Obviously, like, we need this to fix Bitcoin. But, well, what if this wasn't just like the 4 megabyte transaction size limit increase? What if there is a critical bug in the Taproot design that completely kills the Bitcoin project? And I was the one at the forefront yelling at everyone to upgrade their nodes of doing that. What have I done? Did I just kill the only chance of humanity to live a free and prosperous life? Well, fuck. I mean, good luck trying to live with that burden.
Well, yeah, but this is my point. This is what I'm trying to get from you. How does one account for the unknown unknowns? I mean, obviously, philosophically, you can't, but we have to have an approach to them in some capacity in order to act, right? And especially if we want to avail of these presumed benefits that we conjure up over the years, how is the average pleb, so to speak, to assess, what risks they are taking on when they support any given change?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, that's the ultimate question. And the conundrum is, so I guess the obvious answer is just don't change the rules anymore, right? Leave it as is, don't touch it, just don't fuck it up. Cool, that's a reasonable conservative outlook. But then you look closely at Bitcoin and you see of how badly it is broken, like seriously badly broken, in a way that its current set of rules, especially before SegWit and Taproot, make it literally impossible for it to achieve its mission of becoming a global money. Fucking impossible. Right? Like, no questions asked. And like, no questions asked since 2009, right? Bitcoin isn't private, Bitcoin doesn't scale, never, right? Yeah, that's correct, because especially what was released in 2008 and 9 was shit, It was absolute shit. It was unusable, and on many, many, many levels. So not acting, not fixing the bugs, not improving the scalability and the security and the privacy of the system is not an option either, right? So to some extent, we're fucked if we change it, and we're fucked if we don't. And I'm lost for words. I don't know what to do.
Well, that instills confidence for sure. But I mean, and I didn't mean for this to become a conversation all about making upgrades to Bitcoin. But again, it is one of those things that I think that just there seems to be maybe for this very reason, there seems to be a lack of appreciation or understanding for how to assess any given thing, because as you just say, I mean, the trade-offs are not so good all the way up and down, perhaps. One of the things that, as you say, you are just a normal person, you became interested in making a change, and you did research around it, you lobbied for it, and it ultimately got included. And, let's presume the outcome was beneficial or positive. I guess one of the arguments is that, and this is an argument in terms of the frequency of changes, because in an environment where there's always unknown unknowns, you don't know if, you're making the right decision or not. How frequently should you roll the dice? Should it be once every year, once every 4 years, once every 10 years, once every 20 years? And so there's always the well-meaning mistakes that could fuck everything up. But then there's also the case that if you are a malicious attacker, 3-letter agency person, whatever, you're thinking, okay, we get more at-bats here. If we can somehow inculcate a culture or promote the idea that changes need to be made ever more frequently, not for every 4 years, but every 3, every 2, every 1, every 6 months, whatever, willy-nilly. If you can promote it well enough, then it should be done. Then we just get so many more chances to, squeeze something in there that's going to be existential to this thing. And, it's going to fuck it up, as you say. And so how do you look at frequency of, maybe to make it, I guess, somewhat relevant? Again, I'm not very well read on any of this stuff, but the drive chain, side chain issue. And I guess it's somewhat relevant to what you do, because I think there's been at least some talk that, existing privacy solutions are crap, and we won't have good privacy or scalability unless we implement this change. And so how do you think about frequency of change and the rationale for change, and how that represents an attack vector?
Yeah, definitely. Right. And I think Ethereum is an interesting example there. I guess it was the first hard fork of the Ethereum protocol was with the DAO hack, right? Someone hacked this massive smart contract, stole a shit ton of, quote unquote, stole a shit ton of Ethereum, enough to make a lot of important people very angry. And they broke the rules, right? And reverted a transaction, basically took money out of an account, moved it into another account. I mean, that's a pretty, shitty move for a lot of reasons. But the majority of nodes and developers and users went with the change because, I mean, there's obvious, it makes sense, right? There's obvious reasons to do it because look, someone just hacked the money of God knows how many people. So yeah, we should try something to fix that. The argument makes sense, but cool, you break the rules. You do it the first time, right? With good reasons. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many hard forks were in Ethereum before or after, to be honest, but probably a lot. And by now, there's this hard fork to move to proof of stake, like away from proof of work into proof of stake, which means they literally broke the system. Like proof of stake is not cryptodynamically secure. It simply does not work. If the adversary gains the majority of coins in circulation, the system is irrevocably broken. And as soon as one person is the wealthiest, he can prevent anyone else from making transactions that he does not like. And so censorship becomes unstoppable in proof of stake if the attacker is large enough.
It's just the same thing we've always had, just with unicorns and rainbows this time.
Yeah, right? and proof of work is the solution, right? Mm-hmm. The attacker can have today 99% of the hashing power. Great. but he cannot stop you from building new computers to start hashing with. And so there is no monopoly. There is no way that even the largest attacker can exclude you from hashing, and therefore from being part in building the longest chain, which means confirming transactions. So yeah, like with Ethereum, arguably they started their hard forking journey with an honest attempt of getting money back to the people who deserved it, right, who've worked hard for it. A couple of years later, they introduced fatal flaws into their system that are irrevocable. That can very easily happen to Bitcoin. And even, some might say that, sure, but it's just not practically possible to hard fork Bitcoin. Cool, point well taken. But you can kill Bitcoin with a soft fork too. Right? There's many rules that we could add, not break old ones, but add new rules that would very, very much end the Bitcoin network. Right? Peter Todd wrote excellently about this evil soft fork idea, I think 2016 on his blog, that you can soft fork the rules of inflation, right? Or of censoring certain coins from being spent. Those are all rules that can be soft forked. So even hiding under this fact that it's just not possible to break the rules of Bitcoin, because hard forks are practically speaking not possible, that doesn't hold either. Because with a soft fork and given enough adoption, Bitcoin can be broken very much. So yeah, why would we ever change Bitcoin at that point then? And there's very good reasons for why not. But then again, can we fix the system within the existing set of rules, like without changing or adding any of the rules? And probably theoretically it's possible, right? I mean, we just need to get smarter about it in some way or shape or form. Like we don't need to change gravity or air density in order to build planes, right? We just need to get better with metallurgy and craftsmanship, etc., and research and mathematics, physics, etc., until we get to a point where we can overcome the almost insurmountable odds of flying. Arguably, that's the same case with Bitcoin. It's just, if gravity would just be a little less, it would be a lot easier to fly. So the quick and easy path, right? Just fiddle a little bit with gravity and voila, much easier to fly. But what else have we done? And how long will it take us until we find out what we have done? I don't know.
Well, at the expense of potentially beating a dead horse here, why don't I ask more specifically, not how does one, but how does Max Hillebrand assess changes to Bitcoin? Because again, I mean, and maybe that's too broad. So I'll make it more specific. As we know, I think we both agree that you increase the frequency of a potential risk and you increase the frequency of risks generally. Again, if you have 10 times when you change something versus 2, presumably you're enhancing the attack or risk surface. And so even with something as seemingly, maybe simple is not the right word, but as basic as frequency of change, not to say anything about what those changes may be, because if we're pursuing this line of thinking, like, well, how should one assess the validity, the risks and the benefits of making a potential change? And of course, the frequency of changes is a part of that analysis. How does Max Hillebrand think about frequency of changes? Is it simply case by case, the logic and the details of any given change, or is there an approach to frequency itself that you don't think should be violated in some way?
Yeah, excellent question. And ultimately, I don't know, right? But what I found funny is that with SegWit, what we introduced was the ability to signal for the activation of soft forks, and I think up to 32 soft forks can be signaled in parallel, right? So what is technically possible is to do 32 soft forks, not just sequentially, but at the same time, right? Which to some extent was a little bit ambitious. Like, it took us, 5 years after SegWit before we had enough courage to change Taproot. And it's been, already 2 years after Taproot, and there's not even the next change of the rule set anywhere closely to being seriously proposed. In fact, all of the past attempts to propose any very reasonable change to the Bitcoin rules was just ground to a halt for numerous reasons. So I think reality gives us an answer to this, that Bitcoin seems to ossify in the sense of it gets more difficult and more difficult to change the rules as time progresses. And arguably, that's a good thing, right? Because less change and less frequent change leaves the room or leaves the door closed for potential malicious activity. But on the other hand, I mean, guys, Lightning Network is broken. Like, seriously, it's broken. It doesn't work. Like, it's just really bad design.
Can you put some meat on that?
So with the Lightning Network is a network of channels, payment channels. A payment channel is a agreement among two people who have a shared UTXO on the blockchain, a 2-of-2 multi-signature coin, basically. And these two parties now pre-sign Bitcoin transactions, spending out of that shared coin to whatever destination they have. The trick is they pre-sign a transaction, but they don't yet publish it, right? So that means if the two parties agree, they can pre-sign the follow-up transaction without publishing that, and they can pre-sign the next transaction without publishing that, etc. So ultimately, they have an infinite amount of transactions that can be pre-signed, moving economic value or monetary value without ever broadcasting those update transactions to the Bitcoin network or to the blockchain, basically increasing the scalability of the system, well, infinitely, ultimately. That's cool and all, but because of numerous quirks in the Bitcoin protocol and the fact that Satoshi had the first idea of payment channels. I'm not sure, it might be even in the white paper with the end sequence number, but his naive idea of a payment channel was very quickly found out to be not working because it could be cheated. And now with the Lightning Network, we have a method or a protocol of how two people can coordinate this payment channel to in a way that they cannot be cheated from, which is excellent. It's just that this punishment mechanism is done in a way that the two parties have to remember every update to the payment channel. You can prune some parts, but basically every time you update the state of who owns how much money in this 2-of-2 multi-signature, that has to be remembered by both people. And if you forget even one small part of this piece of data, then you're at risk of being stolen from, right? Irrevocably. And that's a massive design flaw, and it leads to a lot of headaches. So basically, you need to keep an ever-growing amount of data that you can't even hierarchically, deterministically derive like you do with Bitcoin private keys, right? In Bitcoin private keys, you have one set of 12 words, and that gives you infinite amount of private keys. You just need to remember those 12 words, and you have the backup of all of the keys that you would use. Great. We don't have that in Lightning, right? You need to keep, every time you make a transaction, you need to remember a new random arbitrary set of data, and you have to back it up. So after every time you make an update to your payment channel, you need to have a secure backup of making sure that this piece of data is there, right? And if you lose any of your old backups, you're at risk of losing all of your money, and that's not good. There are solutions to this. There are solutions to this since 2017 or something, long before we even released the Lightning Network. But the solutions require a change to the Bitcoin consensus protocol, and L2, or Lightning symmetry, as it's now known. It has been hashed to death for 5-8 years or something like this. And we know it's super important. We know that Lightning is basically broken without it and has no chance of scaling to reach enough capacity to satisfy the need of all the humans and computers and robots who will want to use Bitcoin as a money system. So yeah, we know we need to fix it. We just can't really, because in order to fix it, we need to change the consensus rules, and in a non-trivial way, in a way where we're not sure what the unknown unknowns are. And the proposed solution from like 5 years ago are radically different from the proposed solutions that we have nowadays. Right? So we know about the problem, we know about solutions to the problem, but we keep discovering better or at least different solutions to the problem. So which exact solution should we now implement? Right? Like, I know there's 10 different proposals. Which one do we pick? That's a consensus problem, right? How do we solve consensus problems of how to change the consensus solution algorithm? Like, it's just inherently extremely difficult. So I think to some extent we really have to count ourselves lucky with any practically possible change to the Bitcoin consensus rules that we can get away with. Like in hindsight, oof, man, SegWit and Taproot, like, whew, people like Eric Lombroso or Peter Woolley, man, dude, these guys have like single-handedly saved Bitcoin from absolute disaster. And if they would not have succeeded back then, Bitcoin would probably be dead by now, or at least way smaller. I mean, think about if the Lightning Network doesn't exist, where's Bitcoin today? Like, it isn't here today, right? So, I mean, the biggest thanks and gratitude to anyone who was meaningfully contributing to SegWit and Taproot, and that's definitely not me, by the way. I did jack shit, right? I was cheerleader on the sideline. The real heroes were the ones to actually come up with and implement and review this code. Thanks, guys. Like, we owe you big time, and I think please keep going, because there's many more things that really need to be fixed in this protocol. On top of that, it's not just consensus rules that have to be improved. Like, the consensus rules in Bitcoin are pretty small, all things considered, and there's even more problems outside of the consensus rules than inside. Like the mempool, for example. Oh dear God, don't get me started on that. It's deadly broken, right? So, and thankfully, that, like, it's not even consensus part, right? It should be easy to fix compared to changing the consensus rules, but oh mighty, it's broken so much. So, yeah, there's just a shit ton of work to do, not just in Bitcoin consensus rules, but in every single piece. Like wallets broken, Lightning broken. It's really, like, there is a shit ton of work to do, and just sitting on our hands and hoping that everything will be all right, even without us doing the work, that's not gonna cut it. That I'm very convinced about. The chances of us killing the system by with good intentions, trying to improve it, that's very much not zero, right? And that's what makes this such a dangerous adventure, where we know we have to do something, but we know that any action that we could possibly do might be the last for the protocol, and that's a tough responsibility.
You're instilling so much confidence in me today, Max. But you know what? I spoke. So there's so much in what you just said. I'm going to blank on most of the things I wanted to break into, but it makes me think. I had a conversation with James O'Byrne, I think in January, and I mean, this is part of what we've been discussing, right? Because you take an issue like custody and you say, not good enough, needs to be better.
Horribly broken, by the way. Like custody, another huge, but like, fuck, it's so bad. Right.
Sure. Fair enough. But then first of all, there's the question of, like, how are we assessing that it's broken? You know, and how much of that assessment is predicated on our own expectations and presumptions. Now, there's obviously, it's more complex than this, but let's just say not enough people are self-custodying Bitcoin. And let's leave aside that not enough people can, but let's just say not enough people are. Okay, well, that betrays my opinion that there should be more by now. Maybe that opinion is right, maybe it's wrong. Maybe things are proceeding just as they are supposed to be. So there's all these assumptions wrapped up in all of our assessments of these things. And then, of course, if you can get past that, well, how are we to judge whether something is where it should be or not, and therefore whether it needs intervention or not? If we get past that, we can say, okay, well, where should the intervention take place? Should the intervention take place on the base layer, on consensus level, or should it take place on the client level? And then there's discussion, well, I don't know which solutions are possible or available in either domain. And this the two examples I'll bring up now are not perfectly representative or anything, but just to kind of make the point, it's like, well, do you go the opvault route or do you go the Fedimint route, right? And again, they're not exactly the same, but let's just put them in the category of attempting to be solutions for custody and scalability to some degree. And so again, what I've been trying to tease out of you this whole conversation is, how do we make those assessments? And a simple answer might be, well, the market is going to, sort out most of that kind of stuff. And that's fine. But as individuals running code and, expressing our preference in that way, again, like the framework for how to think about these things is really hard to nail down. And the last point I'll make about that is add this onto the question is, and why I bring up James as part of our discussion was, all of these assumptions somewhere down the line are based on, I don't know if you heard that, but all these assumptions somewhere down the line are based on, what do you define Bitcoin to be, or what do you want it to be? Because that will inform the changes you think are valid or not valid, the approaches that you think are good or not, the risks that you perceive, the benefits you perceive, all that kind of stuff. And the thing we kind of related it to was the Constitution, right? And you often hear in law and the interpretation of law, a ruling might come down, say, well, this ruling is not consistent with the letter of the law, but it is consistent with the spirit of the law. And so you have this kind of notion, this mutually agreed upon notion that what you want or what you define something as is not always what it's explicitly defined as, but there's a spirit behind it, right? There's something that it's in reference to, that those rules and parameters that we've been alluding to throughout this discussion are attempting to allow to be expressed, allow to exist in the world, to come out. And, in Bitcoin land, there's a bit of a divide between the uber technical and the uber philosophical and the uber economic. And what's beautiful about this place is that there can be conversation between them all, which is great. And most of us land more so in one of those buckets than the other. But the reason why I think it's important for them all to communicate with one another is for that reason, because I would say that that whole spirit letter dynamic is probably more in the philosophical and then in the economic and then in the technical sort of realm of the discussion. But again, if the fundamental issue when we are assessing anything is what we deem something to be, or what our aspiration for it is to be actually is, then we should have some clarity on what that spirit is, so that we can cohere, or we can steward the letter in accord with that. And throughout this conversation, there hasn't been any easy or definitive answers, when I've asked you a bunch of these questions, and maybe that's kind of the point, as is the case with something like the Constitution. There's like, just when you write it doesn't mean that all the work is done and now it's just a matter of, there it is, just follow the rules. It's this constant negotiation, constant trying to keep, chaos at bay and keep the order that you're trying to establish intact. And so, I mean, this is kind of how I see this issue and why it's so tangly. So I'll throw it back over to you if you have any comments on what I just said. And if not, then more of a direct question is, when we're looking at new proposals, as we kind of always are, when do you think we should be looking, on the software protocol side of things? And when do you think we should be looking on the client or economic side of things?
Yeah, a really good question. And probably every time we have to look at all of it, at least try to. And I mean, try to, because it's such a huge, broad subject that it's impossible to cover it all, right? For sure, it's impossible for a single person and even for a group of dedicated people to seriously look at all of these important aspects that should be taken a look at. Good luck. I mean, good luck, right? Like, how many people knew about, for example, the 4 megabyte transaction size limit that Taproot introduced? I'm sure a couple people knew about it, but was it really at the forefront of everyone's mind when we're doing these decisions? Probably not. right?
Or even if it
And
was, the implications of it wouldn't have been obvious to people, or could, may not have been.
Yeah. So this is just, it's so weird, right? That we're even trying to do this, like to engineer a money. Like, who would have thought that's a good idea? Because like, how are you ever gonna agree on how the design of it should be? Like, I mean, seriously, right? That's the entire problem of fiat money, right? If humans want to create the money, then they're usually gonna fuck up, right? Every human created currency dies within what, on average 7 years or something like this. Why is Bitcoin any different? That's a tough question, man. And I don't know. And maybe we're a bit we have a lot of hubris of thinking that this time we have it figured out. Maybe not. Right? And well, that's a happy note, I guess. But it's just, man, it's so difficult, right? And it's not going to get any easier. And the another sad note on top of that is like, what if the attacks haven't even yet started? Right? What if 100% of the people involved in the project really mean the best for it, really want to see it succeed? There's a high chance that that's true, right? Because I mean, it gathered so many great people, and I don't think I've met someone who actually wanted to end the protocol, like to destroy it. Maybe I just don't meet these types of people, or maybe they're just really in the tiny minority. But so let's assume we're all really trying to do our best here. I mean,
you could still,
is it good enough? Right? Like, yeah, even under these perfect ideal scenarios, it seems we're struggling a lot. So what happens when all of a sudden a couple of people who don't have the best of the system in mind come in and wreak havoc? Are we ready for that? I don't know, right?
And yet you act as though, well, and yet you're compelled or inspired to devote yourself to this thing and trying to ensure that it is successful because of what success means or what its success means or represents to you.
Yeah, I think so. Right? It's like, I mean, there's a non-zero chance that we're not bullshitting ourselves here, right? That we've actually stumbled upon something. And even though that chance might be slim, it's a bright enough hope at the end of the tunnel that it seems worth to pursue it at quite large odds. And to some extent, even if we fail, I had the blast of my lifetime. Like, I mean, this is a fucking adventure for sure. And just alone for the people I've met along the way, I mean, great. I just hope that me and my generation won't be the last to experience something like that. But like recently did some reading on Jung and his, he was part of Vienna, of the Vienna times in like the 18th, 19th century. Like Vienna was the cradle of civilization in so many aspects. And when you read these old writings, the amount of hope that was there, the amount of just natural expectation of progress, right? That we thought it can only get better, man. Like, we have this all figured out. Just progress, right? But then that hope died, and Vienna fell hard. And I really wonder if that's going to happen again, right? Where with Bitcoin, this magical moment in place and time occurs where we seem to have found something that really is groundbreaking, is enabling progress on an unheard of scale and seemingly impossible to stop. But is anything impossible to stop, right? Who knows? I think though, like, that's why it's in part so important why we have journalists or chroniclers like you to capture that spirit of the people living through that moment, because I'm so sure that in a couple decades we look back on this time as, well, either the crazed ravings of some hopelessly naive optimists, or maybe some people who were just struggling with gripping their head about this actual long-lasting miracle that we have discovered. I really don't know, but the fact that we have the records and hopefully we'll be able to preserve them might at least pass on the spirit of this hope to the next generations, even if the technology fails.
I think that's well said and a great point, if a sobering one. But, you know, I often think about the same thing. And it's funny you bring up Vienna, because like, I don't know too much about the history of Vienna, but I know when I was there and I would be sitting in the gardens and I'd be walking past like the opulent buildings, and I'd be thinking about all the people that we know, artists, musicians, you know, whomever that was around during its kind of the height of it, or during that era that you just referred to. And I think, you know, I think about what was the spirit that was inspiring that, you know, and you might say some of it was religious and some of it was economic and some of it was, you know, there's many contributors, let's say, but you know, something coalesced in that time to have like this explosion of, you know, beauty and opulence and artistic, you know, capacity and all these things. And of course, there are many eras throughout history that have had those sorts of dynamics. And as Bitcoiners, it seems we like to look at them and tease out what those constituent components or inputs might have been. And then we get all excited and thinking like, well, you know, much of it was in some way connected to the money and all the different things that money coordinates and fosters. And if we really are dealing with something that's a massive upgrade to that mechanism, what might we expect downstream of it? You know, and I'm on board with that. And, you know, I think the changes which that vision is instilling in people, that, as you said, I cover a lot on my show, talking to, you know, the average Bitcoiner, so-called, out there, is kind of representative of, and it showcases, and they all seem to be kind of moving in that direction and striving for that. And that's great. But I do wonder, and an example I often use is like the hippies in the 60s really thought they stumbled on a new way of living, right? You know, society was going to be completely reformed, and you know, there's going to be a lot more love, for lack of a better way of describing it. But, you know, they really thought that something had been introduced into the consciousness, particularly in psychedelics, but in Eastern practices and all this kind of stuff, that was going to change everything. And there was a ton of momentum behind it. And then, you know, cold water got poured on it all and it went underground. And, you know, culture was definitely impacted by it tremendously in a number of different realms. But, you know, that vision never really came to be that so many at that time held. Now, I don't want to admit, and I don't think I don't think the probability is that we're wrong. But to your point, I do think there's even if we are, that spirit that you referred to, that spirit of hope, whether, you know, people uncover it in a time capsule 20, 50, 100, 200 years from now. And, you know, that's an interesting point, because, you know, this sort of conversation evolves or devolves, depending on your perspective, quickly to a deeply philosophical, metaphysical, or religious kind of conversation, because why do we appreciate the thing, you know, what Bitcoin represents? Right? Let's say it represents freedom. Let's say it represents fairness, you know, these sorts of things. Why does that have such a resonance with us? And I think, you know, one potential answer is because in our, you know, it's so deeply instilled in us that perhaps we don't even need a historical context. But for those of us that do, we can look throughout history and we can see the value of that spirit whenever it's been able to emerge, whether it was, you know, in Vienna at a certain time, or in ancient Greece, or in ancient Egypt, or where have you. And we also have the examples of when that spirit's been depressed in some way, you know, and those eras we generally construe as being darker, less productive, less flourishing, all that kind of stuff. And so there is this sense that we're we're always trying to grasp a certain spirit and bring it into both ourselves and into our interactions and into our era or into our time. And we tend to probably value more the ideas and the implements or the tools that permit us to do that more effectively. And I think that's another way you could characterize the excitement around Bitcoin, is that people see that it is representative of, again, some people will be offended by this terminology, but a certain spirit of these different values and principles that we've seen to be conducive to flourishing over the course of history. And as a result of its representation and capacity to foster those things, we devote ourselves to it, which again is another religious word, right? You know, and you're a perfect example of that. You have devoted your life to this thing because of the good that you see in it. And so I think that's another one of those cycles of history, that anytime we see something with that capacity or potential, we elevate it, we devote ourselves to it, and we try to expand it. And I guess the 21 million Bitcoin question here is whether or not we're doing that in reference to a tool that has genuine staying power now, and how much of its staying power is dependent upon or influenced by our interaction with it. You know, because to bring this kind of conversation full circle, I think part of the reason why even the ordinal inscription stuff with Taproot, I think why it spooks so many people is because a lot of people walk around with this idea that Bitcoin is immutable, can't change, it's a forever thing. You know, the realm of humans cannot fuck it up, and that's why it's going to win as money forever. But that is just, you know, evidently not the case. And examples like, you know, congesting, you know, block space with whatever the fuck is like, kind of confronts you with, oh, it's not, it can be changed. And the changes that are implemented can have negative consequences as far as I construe the consequences subjectively. And so, you know, again, it's probably why I'm a bit focused on these conversations, because I am trying to come to grips myself with just how, well, I guess just how, I was going to say just how permanent or immutable, but I guess the proper way to say it is just how much staying power this thing has. And then, of course, the more pertinent thing for my own action is how my actions relate to its staying power. Like, how can I orient myself and my actions optimally such that it contributes to the probability of success of this thing? So over to you. I can't remember what question that started with.
Yeah, man, and you want to write a book about that? Like, good luck.
That's what I'm trying right now.
It seems like a futile effort, man. Like, dude, good luck trying to get a grips of this. Like,
yeah,
I mean,
really.
seriously, right? Especially because we're so close and at the front lines of it. Like, to some extent, I think these things benefit of the view of hindsight. Right? Like, a SegWit activation, that was such a chaos for me personally, and I really tried to get a grips of it, and I failed miserably because yeah, even after all of this time afterwards and continuous thinking about it, I get a bit more clarity of what that was, but then still I'm not even sure if, you know, if that's just being melodramatic about the past and having the rose-colored glasses on and you know, changing the things that happened to get the justification for them, or something like this. So it's going to be, I think it's probably impossible to understand Bitcoin at this very moment, and you know, maybe we need another 50, 100 years before we seriously start to grip what this means. But then the big problem is that it seems like Bitcoin as it is now just isn't good enough, right? Maybe it is, but probably it isn't. And
Enough
then
for what?
Yeah, exactly, right. Enough for what? That's the other big question. I guess enough for the inevitable adoption that will come. But then, you know, we, you know, stumbling idiots who for whom it's probably impossible to actually get a grip on the situation, it seems that we're called upon acting in a way to improve the situation, right? Like I really think that like our generation can make or break Bitcoin. Like if we want to, we can kill it. And also if we want to, we can ensure that it will survive for centuries to come. But like, are we seriously the ones, you know? And are we cut out for it? It's I guess a unsolvable question in the heat of the moment. I just really hope that we keep having the privilege of being around at this what seems to be most pivotal point in time, and that we will have the luxury of in 50, 100 years of looking back and really seeing of what this adventure turns out to be. I hope we will, you know, laugh and smile about it, and hopefully about the completely unjustified fears that we had. I really hope that. Let's see if that's the case.
You know, you ask, are we up to the task, basically? And again, talking about that recurring spirit that has this capacity for good or for flourishing, I think it's a hallmark of it that this may indeed be a way of assessing its validity in a sense, in that how it inspires you, both to what degree, you know, so when you encounter something and you see goodness or truth or value in it, to what degree does it inspire you? But the other side of that is, how does it restrain your attempts to serve it in a sense? And, you know, another way of saying that is just, what degree of humility does it inculcate in you? And there's, you know, so many references to the Bible for pretty much everything that one might encounter in the world today. But, you know, the Tower of Babel is probably a good one, because it's like, well, you want to reach God, right? And that's a good, you know, you want to be maximally, you want to have a optimized relationship, let's say, with God. But is it right to, you know, build a tower toward them and presume that you can build it in such a way? And so, you know, I think a parallel here is like, you know, there's extreme value here, something of extreme value, but how do you engage it? You know, and you want to serve it, let's say, even not even just for your own self-interest, but for the interests of others, because that's how you're oriented. You're looking beyond just yourself. What is the best way to serve it? You know, is it always just thinking about how it could be better, or is it recognizing that an element of its value is how you humble yourself before it, in a sense, how you don't mess with things, and then finding that middle ground between conservatism and progress? You know, and again, I mean, those are kind of like, that's why our political domain is probably split between those two fundamental points of view, because they are very fundamental. It's like conservatism is known, tradition, worked before, reliable, all that stuff that, you know, confronts the unknowns of existence. Progress is, yeah, but what might be, what could be, innovation, advancement, expansion, but also unknown territory, threats that we haven't encountered before, new modes of operating, new environments, you know, and so you can't have one or the other, because, you know, if you over rely on conservatism and tradition, you don't get any progress. If you over index on progress, you destroy yourself, because you delve too far into novelty and you're not equipped for it. And so there's this like eternal battle between those two forces to try to find what the synthesis of conservatism and progress is. And you know, an element is absolutely humility, you know, but how much humility is one to have? You don't want to humble yourself into, you know, not lifting a finger in service of something, but you don't want to lack sufficient humility that you think you can, you can optimize everything in accord with your own assumptions or definitions about things, so it's likely the case that we're confronting an eternal problem here. But I think we're all hopeful that, there's been a glitch in the matrix in some way. Like we're something
this time is different.
Well, fuck yes, kind
yeah,
of.
Fuck, right?
But that some form of novelty has emerged, as it always does, and it's changed the game a little. Maybe those fundamental forces are no different, but it's I don't know, man.
Yeah, like I totally feel you, man. Right? Like it can't actually be different, right? There's nothing new under the sun. But I mean, look at it, right? Like it's obviously really fucking different, right? Like it's not just Bitcoin. It's like basically all the tools of the cypherpunk. Like look at strong encryption. Like holy fucking shit, strong encryption. Like what? Right? Like absolutely insane. Like such a monumental shift, and yeah, then Bitcoin just as a small extension of what's possible with really fucking large numbers. It's absolutely insane. So it feels as if everything has changed, and seemingly in favor of the individual.
Right.
But has it really though? Right? Or are we just projecting our own ideas onto a more base layer, barren and yeah, neutral technology? Ultimately, I really don't know. But there's, well, yeah, just it's wild.
Well, maybe this is why the eternally valid approach, whether you're a caveman or someone living in the 21st century, is to, pursue what you deem to be most valuable with the utmost honesty, integrity, humility that you can muster. Like basically always orient yourself based on what you think are the most valid values and principles, whether you derive them religiously or philosophically or otherwise, and commit yourself to them as much as you know how or have the capacity to do. And regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the technical details of the time, you maximize the probability of positive results, or at least you do your part in maximizing them. And maybe that's all you can ever do. And maybe sometimes history surprises you by, the conditions of the time or the tools at your disposal amplify your own efforts to some degree, or make those efforts more fruitful than in other times. And maybe that's that's the cycle of innovation and technological progress. And yeah, it just seems like you can't go wrong deploying that approach regardless of your circumstance. And maybe to the extent that you get changing technological circumstances, that approach will optimize it either way. And maybe you don't have nothing is forever is a long time, but maybe you extend the benefit of novel emergences as far as they can be extended when you have that approach. And then you also, I think, prepare yourself, or you put yourself in the best position possible to contend with the reemergence of chaos whenever it may come, whether it's 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, because we are seemingly at the mercy of cycles and forces that some of which we will never fully understand or be able to observe, but we may be able to come to a framework or orientation for accounting for those cycles, and then figuring out how best to act in reference to them. And maybe that's the best we can hope for. And that's, that doesn't mean Bitcoin's not going to succeed for another 500 years, but it probably means that there are forces even more eternal, and they will continue to exact their effects on everything, including Bitcoin and human consciousness and everything in between.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're saying resonates with me, because I've I've tried to live by a set of small but very carefully chosen principles, that ultimately that of individual sovereignty, and try to apply that in areas of economics, psychology, technology, and so far it seems to be working out. Like I'm like cautiously optimistic that this is an approach that seems to actually work. It's almost like a hack or a cheat code. Like and well, I'm not sure if the couple of years that I've been trying it, let's say, is enough to form an actual judgment of it, and or if it might instead build blind spots. And again, really big and tough questions that I don't know the answer to, but so far I have not seen enough evidence to say that the path that I'm on is fundamentally flawed. It might be in ways that I'm ignorant about, but so far I'm not convinced about that. Yeah. And that's and it seems to not just be me like that, right? That's the most reassuring thing about the cult of Bitcoiners, let's say. That a lot of people have tried similar things, like living these principled lifestyles, and it seems to be working decently well for many people. Maybe not for all, but for a staggering amount of people. Like I haven't met anyone basically who seriously encountered Bitcoin and seriously opened his heart towards it, and not being changed to the better. As stupid as that sounds, but I mean, I think your podcast absolutely proves that point. So, yeah, I mean, if we're just being naive and having those blind spots, then I mean, they're good blind spots to have. Like, again, at least it was an adventure. That is for absolutely certain.
Yeah, well, earlier you said we're kind of fucked if we do and fucked if we don't. But now we're at the point of the conversation where we might be able to say, well, we win if we win either way. Basically, is kind of what I'm hearing from you now. So, of course, we contradicting ourselves, and everything resolves in paradox. And well, I mean,
that's actually like that's the serious point, man. Like, it's almost like having severe schizophrenia. Like the mood swings between the hyper bullishness and the hyper bearishness I don't know, it's tough to deal with. Like this might maybe be a sign that we're fooling ourselves, right? That the extremes are so far apart, and oscillating between them frequently, right? And at quite a rapid rate. Like I can tell you a million reasons why Bitcoin is broken, why Lightning is broken, why Coinjoin, Wasabi, all of this is really seriously broken. But simultaneously, I mean, it's so beautiful, right? And it actually works, and it's still around even after all of these years of imperfections, and that's just so hopeful, right? Because practically speaking, it's fucking perfect. Right? If you look closely, it's horribly broken. But for all intents and purposes, I mean, it's here, and look at it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this discussion about blind spots and how something, may not make sense or work in theory, but in practice it does. And, trying to identify why that is, and again, I think it does come down to every day we have choices to make, and if you're clear-minded and you're principally oriented, then you try to take actions and make choices in the direction of those principles and values, and you try to align yourself with them. And it's all those actions every day that perhaps keep things held together sufficiently for them to work. And we talk about blind spots, and we kind of speculate, like, are we seeing things truthfully or clearly? It's like, well, good luck defining that also. I mean, so, everything is ultimately has a subjectiveness to it, but experience would seem to indicate that there is an absoluteness that subjectiveness is interfacing with. And, your point about, the hack that you're using by, orienting your life in this way with certain principles and certain work and such, and that so many have done the same. I mean, it's a topic I often explore, and, it conjures up the question like, well, if that is truly the case and you're not just completely deluding yourself, doesn't that have to say something about our metaphysical environment, that orienting yourself in that way is producing results that you would deem beneficial, positive, good, generative, conducive to flourishing, etc., conducive to a healthy body, healthy relationships, all that kind of stuff? Like, I think that's kind of basically the religious assertion. It's like, if you orient yourself a certain way by certain principles, then you actually are cohering with something that is absolute in some other domain. And that's why it works so well. And I think the same assertion is one that, and why Bitcoin seems to have this religious sort of fervor, is because I think the same kind of claim is made with Bitcoin. It's like, it has these values or principles embedded into it, or, the so-called spirit that we've been talking about. And that's used to guide how it's stewarded and held up and changed and what have you. And the fact that it having those values and principles embedded in it, let's say, is working so well, does the same sort of assessment not apply? It's like, well, are they cohering with something more fundamental even? So again, I feel like that's, consciousness doesn't work if you get certainty, almost in a sense. Like, you'll always be able to expand out to unknown, of course. And I think it would kind of collapse if you could just know everything, right? You need the paradox of the eternal unknown, but an element of that, the reason why it's somewhat paradoxical, is because despite never being able to nail down certainty, despite never being able to see the face of God, if you will, to use some dramatic language, you are still able to progress or pursue or advance in the direction of what appears by all ways of assessing to be good or truthful or liberated, in that direction. And maybe that's all we got, like, what else are you going to determine your behavior by? And what other things are you going to look for out in the world to gravitate to and to devote yourself to and to work on? And again, this is a 5-hour-long discussion in and of itself, and there's one more thing I wanted to get to before I let you go, but suffice it to say that it seems to be that a lot of people are acting as though something like that is the case for them, because as we keep saying, whether or not this thing is what we think it is or what we can articulate it to be, it seems to be the case that it's having a profound positive impact on a lot of people's lives when, as you say, they open their hearts and minds to it.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, this can basically be constilled into do not steal, or mind your own business. But if it's really as simple as that, and if the outcomes of adhering to this very simple rule are so extreme as we're feeling it, then like, why haven't we done it before, right? And maybe if we've attempted it before, why did it fail? But the cost doesn't seem too big, right? Just don't steal. Like, it's pretty fucking simple, but the outcomes of it are, like, you and I have been trying to distill the outcome of it, and it's just breathtaking. So are we just like, do we have to ruin it for ourselves like that much? Are we very masochistic as a side hobby? I don't know, but it just seems so insane that it seems to have taken us thousands of years to to come to such a conclusion. But the conclusion is so simple. And I guess maybe distilling it down to its essence is the hardest part of it. But as it seems, we have distilled it down. I mean, let's not squander the pot of gold that we seemingly have discovered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but you know, I think to answer your question, I mean, one, we're both probably a little bit idealistic and romantic, which is why we find ourselves here. But you know, the idealists are always the ones that, you know, are trying to push things forward, I suppose. But to your question, you know, don't steal. You maybe could also add in there, don't lie, don't cheat. I mean, they're all there, and they're all, of course, massively bound up in Bitcoin. But I think, and this kind of maybe contradicts what we said before, where, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. It's different this time, right? And maybe that's just something we tell ourselves. But is it not different this time? Because before, of course, you know, people recognize that since time immemorial, like, yeah, don't steal, property rights. But the only manner that they could be enforced was to concentrate force, to concentrate power and authority, and to have that authority be the one to erect the rules and the parameters that we were alluding to before. And that worked, right? Because, okay, rules and parameters, you know, don't steal is enshrined in some way. And that does facilitate cooperation and production and trade and innovation and all that kind of stuff. Better, you know, improved life, let's say. But the kicker was whoever enforces the rules can contravene the rules. And rules always were the product of the concentration of power. And therefore, that power could always be corrupted, and always inevitably was. Is this the first time we have the capacity to enforce rules without concentrating power? Is this the first time we have the capacity to allow people to opt in or subject them to rules without the means by which those rules are upheld able to be corrupted, because they've been that so-called power has been distributed rather than concentrated? I think that is something that, and the reasons for that are, as you said before, the advancements and nature of cryptography, and, you know, incentives and computer code and all the things that we've, you know, that Bitcoin, that are brought together in Bitcoin. But I think that's the thing that's different this time, is authority, and the authority that rules require no longer needs to concentrate power or force. And seemingly as a result of that, those rules, because once that authority, force, or power becomes corrupted, then it dissolves the parameters or the rules that it was charged with upholding. And that's when you get chaos and degradation and suffering and all that kind of stuff. But if what's upholding the rules doesn't concentrate power, and therefore is not corruptible or co-optable, and therefore those parameters and those rules do not degrade and disintegrate and devolve, then what is the outcome? And presumably the outcome is as if the corruption never took place in the first place in other systems that had rules. So it's a bit, I think would you agree that that's what's different this time? We have, the common trope in Bitcoin land, rules without rulers, but the real kind of insight there is that we now have rules that are not dependent upon force, authority, and the corruptibility of that force and authority, which ultimately is what causes their demise. Is that what's different this time? And therefore, are we rightly excited about just how novel of an emergence this thing is, and just how much more enshrined the statement, the ethic of do not steal can now be, and how many people, and now how people can access that rule or that ethic?
Yeah, right. I think what Bitcoin fundamentally is a way for users to define, verify, and enforce the rules of the monetary system. And the kicker is that it's not a third party who does it, but it's you who does that. right? You define, you verify, and you enforce the set of rules that you choose. And I guess the novelty of Bitcoin is in making that efficient, because as you say, someone else defined the rules, someone else verified the rules, and someone else enforced the rules. And each three of these was different sets of people, because otherwise it could not scale. And it would have been way too expensive for everyone to do this at the same time. Like, who's going to produce food? You know, if we all are judge, jury, and executioner at the same time. So it had to be outsourced because it was so expensive, and because of the huge opportunity with dedicating your life to satisfying one of these three, let alone all three of them. And well, yeah, software scales. And the great thing is that it can scale to billions, right? Like, I mean, seriously, man, people need to download a fucking app, right? That's it. That's literally it. And yeah, 8 billion people can download a fucking app. Like, seriously. I mean, sure, Bitcoin is inefficient in bandwidth, computation, storage, blah, 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 blah. Let's not get again into how bad Bitcoin actually is. But if it's really all that's needed to have a computer and do some calculation in the background, and if that now is a way to get rid of pushing that responsibility of these so important areas to outside third parties who are security holds, as Nick Szabo put so beautifully, right? Trusted third parties are security holds. They might be benevolent, but you are beholden to them. And having a system without trusted third parties and one that actually works, I mean, yeah, right. That again, that's why everything's different now, because at scale we can do this, something that was outrageous to even attempt before, and then, you know, just thinking that we're still at the dawn of the computer age, and the amount of inefficiencies that we have in our current models, and therefore by how much we can make it faster, better, and cheaper in like 10 years or something like this. Like, wow. It's like, I mean, look at all of these crazy zero knowledge proof systems that have been invented in the last 5 years alone, right? And I mean, it's not conceivable to have a full definition, verification, and enforcement of the entire consensus rules of every transaction that ever was within less than 10 milliseconds of compute power. Like, that's in the not so distant future anymore, right? That compressing all of the huge computational load that the current Bitcoin software requires by a factor of 1,000. Like, I mean, we literally have papers that do that now. It's just about reviewing and implementing and testing and shipping them. But yeah, like, we can, it's an engineered system, right? And anyone with half a brain looking at it can see all of the countless marginal and substantial improvements that still can be made. So yeah, like, if, you know, like Wasabi is one of these ideas down the same road, right? We don't need to change the rules. We just need to get smarter about using them. And that can be applied to all of these pieces of software, right? Like Lightning vaults, like sidechains, like the zero knowledge roll-up proofs, etc. Like, wow, you know, it got faster, it got cheaper, and it got easier and better. On all of these fronts, simultaneously, improvements of 10x, 100x, 1,000x. And how much of that do we need for the system to actually succeed in the long run? And it doesn't seem like that much anymore, right? Like, I mean, and just looking back the last, 14, 15 years, what Bitcoin is around now, look at the rate of improvement. Like, objectively, like, wow, seriously, like on all of the fronts, and extrapolate that just a little bit. You know, you don't even have to think 50 years ahead or something. Just 5 more years of similar, even if it's slower rate of progress. But as long as there still is that progress, like, wow. But then again, going back to Vienna, right, where everyone was such optimistic and progress, and then fascism shows up. And yeah, that escalated quickly, right? So yeah. Man.
What is it NVK says? Deterministic optimism.
Yeah.
Max, we've been 2 hours. Do you have a hard stop?
No, man.
Okay.
Conversations get good 3 hours in. So
yeah, well, I mean, there's this particular topic is one I love to think about a lot, and just the history of attempting to, well, the balance of power, basically, and that balance, because you were talking about conservatism versus progress earlier, and you could say that rules are kind of the conservative element of that, and then progress is when you bend the rules, right? When you do something that you're kind of not supposed to, that's out of the norm, but it ends up being, and 9 times out of 10 it fails and you die, or the idea is horrible, or the system fails. But that 1 out of 10 times, it's something new and productive that can then be integrated into what will in the future then be part of what is conservative, and that's how we expand the space of what is safe and known and traditional and reliable and all that kind of stuff. Take anything that we deem reliable today, like let's just say, the production of electricity. Well, in caveman days, it certainly wasn't that. And at the early days of the production and, dissemination or transmission of electricity, it wasn't that either, but you make the mistakes, you keep developing, and something, you become far more familiar with it. You're more familiar with where it fits in the grand scheme of everything, and you're therefore more able to steward it and avail of its positive potential, let's say. And I guess I'm hopeful that that's what happens with Bitcoin. And even if things wax and wane, or there are so-called crises in the future, that we won't lose everything. We keep going back to this Vienna example, but sure, maybe the animating spirit of that time was put out in that particular place because of the dynamics of what was going on there, but it reemerged elsewhere, or it was emerging simultaneously somewhere else. And so it's always, and in that way, it was able to maintain its life. And so I really think that one of the things that bodes extremely well for our current circumstance is that what you were just saying, not only the distribution of power, now that we have rules without rulers, and therefore, we don't have that corrupting influence of the government or the king or the whomever, but as you say, now everyone can opt in, and everyone who wants to can contribute, right? I.e., you have an open source ecosystem here. And so to the extent that there still are centralized authorities, or to the extent that what's happening with Bitcoin poses a risk to centralized authorities, which of course it does, and they are therefore incentivized to attempt to block it or hamper it or destroy it, at what point does just the sheer capacity, intellectual firepower, capital, willpower, everything of a globally distributed, motivated, inspired set of thousands, then tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands, and millions, then tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of people working unintentionally together in service of this thing, just simply outcompete whatever central force or authority is attempting to stymie it. And of course, none of us know how that's going to play out, but I'm hopeful that, call it the collective good of humanity, is better than is more powerful than the collective bad of humanity. And again, maybe this is always what things come down to, the eternal battle of good and evil. Which one has more force ultimately? And I think we're dancing around something. We're committed to something. Perhaps we're at the beginning of an era where the good guys are just going to win so fucking hard for an indeterminate period of time, and
Fuck
I'm here
yes.
for it.
Yes. No, but like, you know, seriously, man, we're winning so fucking hard. Like, I mean, if you actually look at it, like, I mean, come on, right? It's so, yeah, it's again, man, these extreme swings of hope and optimism and despair it's really baffling to me. And it, yeah, but you know,
Which anyone listening to this podcast will have experienced, because you got them all down in the dumps in the first half, and now we're picking them back up in the back half.
yeah, but man, I really think we're winning. Like,
Yeah.
Seriously, and really, really hard. I think evil has no chance. And that, yeah, might be extremely naive, but I mean, look at it, right? Unstoppable, unstealable, anonymous money, like right now, like with NOSTR, unstoppable, you know, unstoppable communications, basically. Put these two things together, that's unstoppable marketplaces, unstoppable anonymous, right? Where theft is no longer possible, where monopolies are no longer possible, where nobody can stop you from offering a service, finding your customers, and getting paid for the service or the good. I mean, like, guys, seriously,
Yeah.
How could this possibly be stopped? And if it cannot be stopped, then what is the consequence of an uncorruptible marketplace that is global, inclusive of 8 billion people? I mean, what the actual fuck?
Vienna on steroids.
Yeah, seriously, right? And like Vienna on steroids with infinite amounts of books for everyone. What? Like, imagine, imagine.
I thought you were going to say infinite amount of steroids.
No, but like 100 years ago, having a book was an extraordinarily amount of wealth and privilege, right? Having 10 books, nearly unheard of, right? Having a library of 100 books, 1,000 books. Well, maybe there's one in a big city, you know? But now, not just do you have billions of books, right, available at any time wherever you are, you also have the ability to search them, to condense their knowledge, right, to transfer the knowledge from one book to another specific case that you're currently affected by. Like, what? And like, what? You know, and that technology available for basically free for basically anyone. Like, what does that do to a civilization? I don't think it does anything to its civilization, because anything that comes before that point is not a civilization in hindsight. It's like cave paintings and by cave dwellers. It is so far away from what is possible now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, back to that kind of good versus evil analogy, what I think the freedom to express yourself however you like, and the freedom to express your economic preferences however you like, without friction, without intermediary, without restriction, those two things, especially taken together, and perhaps more in the future, I mean, maybe your leveraged capacity to express value through various aspects of the digital age. You know, AI is obviously going to really change the dynamic of our world, or how we experience it. But the primary two, more than any, is just that people will be able to express who they really are more than we've ever seen in the past, without dilution, without distortion, without any of that. And then it really comes down to, like, well, how much faith do you have in the human race? You know, do you think that given that capacity, given that degree of freedom, it will be more conducive to the expression of good or to the expression of evil? And my experience, you know, traveling largely throughout the world, or had the opportunity to travel a lot in my life, and meeting people from all different backgrounds and places, and every distinction you could think of, that most people are good. Now, yes, most people are, a lot of people are in situations where they don't have a lot of opportunities. They don't have a lot of tools at their disposal. They're ignorant about a broad spectrum of things. But what you can sense for the vast majority of them is what we call goodness. However, we might try to nail down that concept. You can, maybe we don't have to, you can just feel it. And my sense is that with these tools being as accessible as they are and as powerful as they are, that will have a chance to emerge and express itself in the world more so than it ever has before. And again, like, that is a tremendous cause for excitement. And, that's what makes me hopeful about all this, even when we consider the ways in which it may go off the rails, or the ways in which it may, be undone. It's over, those feelings are largely overcome, hopefully not, detrimentally so, not, to blind ourselves, but just if, when we're grappling with that pendulum swing that you've been referring to between ultimate bearishness and ultimate bullishness, it's the thing that skews it towards the bullish side, because that goal or that circumstance is so powerfully hopeful, is so worth everything that you might commit to it, that it's almost like it has to work. It's like that so much is on the table that I think it's going to compel inspiration from, out of and in so many people, that, that happening collectively en masse, again, differing degrees with everyone, of course, but it's just going to be too much to stop, all taken together. And that's certainly my hope, of course, because I think, as you say, we'll then have like a pretty clear demarcation point where it's like there was, and of course, many Bitcoiners kind of tongue in cheek say this, but I think it's, may very well turn out to be real. It's like there was BB and there was AB, there was before Bitcoin and there was after Bitcoin. And, of course, this doesn't help with the religious connotations that Bitcoin carries, nor, maybe we shouldn't be trying to fight that. But suffice it to say, I think the point that it is such it introduces a potential so radically different than any way we've coordinated our affairs with one another before, that it may be so foreign to prior history that we, it's a very clear point of delineation between what happened before and what happened after.
Yeah, it seems like it, right? On many levels. And you see it on the macro and on the micro level, I think. And maybe right now we primarily see it on the micro level. Again, your podcast being the prime example of showcasing people before and after they discovered Bitcoin. And it's a different person. And almost everyone who has encountered this has changed fundamentally, and fundamentally to the better. I'd be as bold as saying that. Mm-hmm. And it's, how many people do you need to fundamentally improve and improve based on their own description, based on description of their friends or family, etc. Like, how often does that need to happen before you make a conclusion from it? And you've chronicled hundreds of people by now, and you're not the only one doing the chronicling. So this is millions of people who have been affected, and to the most extreme extent. So it is, yeah, it really is something.
Let's go back to, I think, maybe the first thing you said when we started this discussion, which is, to avail of the freedom and the benefits that Bitcoin has the potential to grant people, privacy is an integral component of that, because that's what allows you to not be subject to distortion or corruption or forces that would otherwise attempt to intermediate your actions, and most likely malevolently. When we last spoke in the fall privately, not on the podcast, I was basically trying to ask you, like, what is the landscape of privacy out there today? And we talked about the so-called privacy wars and the vitriol on both sides, and how that for the average viewer is probably not very productive because it doesn't give them information that they're really able to use. It's just like, okay, well, this side is repping their side, this side is repping their side, and I'm none the wiser. So how do I make a better decision? But one of the things I was asking you was, how should we be looking at privacy? Not in the sense of whether it's important or not. I think most people kind of intuitively know that it is, or it's not a very hard sell. But it is when we're assessing all the different ways to be private, you know, whether it's how you're using Lightning or using Coinjoins and the different implementations of coin joining, or some of the things we alluded to in some of the proposals that are out there now, side chains, you know, I don't know much about Cashew and eCash and these sorts of things that have come up, I think, since we last spoke. Arc maybe being another one that both, you know, kind of maybe package privacy and scalability or affect both. How are we to think about them, right? How much privacy am I getting when I use a given service, and how much privacy is enough, you know? And these are questions that I think a lot of people have. And I think part of your answer is going to be there's no perfect answer, in keeping with the theme of this discussion. That, you know, you can't just say, well, if you coin join, then you know, and if you do everything well afterwards, then you're perfectly private forever. You know, it's a probabilistic sort of endeavor or action. But so, you know, basically the floor is yours to give me an update on the state of privacy tools today and how one might, you know, beneficially or productively be thinking about them.
Yeah, so I think to start out with, let's define privacy. Right? And from a cypherpunk manifesto, privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. And the fact that you have a choice and about whom to tell something, and the ability to tell something to a select few of people, but not the entire world. Right? That is the kicker, because there's many things that you don't want everyone on this planet to know. You know, there are some things that you want nobody to know. That's a secret. But there's many things that are just private, in the sense of you're okay to tell it your wife or your children, but you would not tell it your neighbor, for example. And this is a fundamental part of being human, right? We have an infinite amount of possible actions that we could take. But the thing is, whenever we take a certain given action, there's the opportunity cost of all of the other actions that we could have taken, but that we didn't. And that is, that just shows that we have to be careful with the words that we speak and the paths that we take, because they come at the opportunity cost of great severity. And so in the Bitcoin context, then, or in the money context, there is a lot of private information when we're talking about money or financials, things that you're just not willing for everyone on this planet to know, like who gave you money and how much and for what, and how much money do you have in total, right? And whom do you send your money to, and how much, and for what reasons, right? These are sensitive information that in some cases, certainly you might want to broadcast it to the world. For example, donating to, you know, a charitable cause. Great, announce and brag that you are the Good Samaritan making donations. But, well, maybe precisely because you don't want to brag, because you actually want to give a donation, not because of the publicity and the reputation that it might give you, but because you actually care, right? For the cause of the donation in and of itself, rather than the reputation that might be on top of it. And that is, well, again, from the Cypherpunk Manifesto, privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. Without that ability for humans to selectively reveal whom to tell which pieces of information, there is no freedom. We are all slaves, because someone else decides what you say and to whom you say it. And, well, that goes really close to torture, right? You don't want to tell where you have the treasure buried, but then someone comes with the $5 wrench and waterboards you until you give up the secrets. right? That is it. A slave does not have privacy. Someone being tortured does not have privacy, right? Because there's drastic consequences for not telling a certain piece of information to the attacker. And well, that's basically why. Without privacy, you're not free. For example, the Bitcoin fundamentally breaks without privacy, because privacy includes the private knowledge of your private key, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you all of a sudden put your private key on a NOSTR post or on a Twitter public forum, then it's no longer private. You have turned a secret into public knowledge, and now anyone can make a signature that will be valid to a certain public key. And if that certain public key has 10 Bitcoin locked up on the Bitcoin blockchain, it will take about 10 milliseconds until one attacker will sign a transaction spending those 10 Bitcoin to himself on a private key that is actually kept private, not being public knowledge for anyone. So Bitcoin necessarily only works with privacy. And the big problem, though, is that whenever you want to use a service, generally speaking, there is a certain amount of information that you have to reveal about yourself to the people whom you're dealing with. And, you know, like when we're having a private conversation, let's say, and we're sitting in a room, I have to reveal the sound of my voice, you know, the look of my face, etc. Those are the things that I have to reveal in order to speak to you. I cannot sit next to you and speak to you without you learning the sound of my voice or the look on my face. And the quest of the cypherpunk, let's say, is it to provide services and useful things that can be used or acquired while revealing as little information as is possible. And so it is very much possible to talk to you without a camera turned on, and so you would not see the expressions on my face. Or it is possible to talk with you with a voice emulator, let's say, if we're talking through cyberspace. And that would be on the cypherpunk ideal a good thing, right? That you can speak to someone without revealing your identity. Because ultimately, in many conversations, not in all, but in many, the identity is salient. It is not required. And very often just the ideas are important enough and the thing that we're actually after. So the same idea then with Bitcoin, right? So in order to receive Bitcoin and to send Bitcoin, there is a certain amount of information that has to be revealed, and not just to one person, but to the entire world. And that is, for example, what's your address? What's your public key? Right? If you want to keep your address a secret, you cannot receive Bitcoin, because every time you want to receive Bitcoin, you need to publish your address. It has to be on the blockchain, stored on every full node that is out there. And therefore, you cannot receive Bitcoin without publishing a certain address. But there is no requirement, for example, getting back to an earlier example, of using the same address for repeated transactions. Because once you use the same address repeatedly, then it's not just that we know that this one address is trying to use the Bitcoin network, but it's doing it so multiple times. And we reveal then, for example, the timing of when are you receiving money repeatedly, right? This is a piece of information that is revealed if you quote unquote misuse Bitcoin, misuse in the sense of you reveal more information than what was absolutely necessary. And we can build technologies like, for example, a wallet that generates a new address every time you get paid. So to not reveal that sensitive information of how frequently and how much do you get paid each time. And that's just one of the few examples of how Bitcoin can be used according those cypherpunk principles that each party to a transaction has knowledge only to which is directly necessary for that transaction. And well, we are trying to fulfill this ideal even further, right? And this is where technologies can help us, and where software can help us. So like in the early days, wallets that generate a new address for each payment, that's a good step in the right direction. And that enables a vast amount of privacy on the receiving side. But in the past, a big problem was always the privacy on the sending side. Because as I said earlier, even though you've received on a fresh address every time, once you spend all of those coins together at the same time in the same transaction, you do reveal the information that, hey, these are the addresses belonging to the same person. And at the point where you then make that payment, you have sacrificed the privacy of the past. And you're making a mistake now that has consequences from the past, right? That now it is clear and easily identifiable that these multiple times a single person, the same person, has received money frequently. And so the ability to spend Bitcoin privately was in the sense of not revealing, for example, how often and how frequently and how much you received in the past, was for a long time an unsolved problem until we discovered that idea of a Coinjoin, alluded to in the Bitcoin white paper, and then really clarified in 2010-ish and put a name on in 2013, of a Coinjoin being this collaborative Bitcoin transaction, where it's not just one person consolidating many coins, but it's hundreds of persons getting together and putting a bunch of coins in the same transaction, so to say. Yeah, so this is basically a way of spending Bitcoin privately. And it is something that was active research and work in progress for a long time. And especially with Wasabi Wallet, and especially in the last year, where we released Wasabi Wallet 2.0, the amount of progress in this small niche of Bitcoin is absolutely staggering. And I'm with my usual torn optimism and pessimism, I can say that I think we fixed the problem. I think we have figured out how to spend Bitcoin anonymously or privately, in the sense that as little information as possible is being revealed to anyone on the outside part, right? Including the service providers and other users of this Coinjoin system. So it seems to me that we've made an insane amount of progress on spending Bitcoin privately, but simultaneously I see all of the little details where it's still fucking broken, which is very optimistic because we know what's broken and we can fix it. And the things that are not yet perfect don't seem to be critical. I think in the next couple of years, the main progress will be to make it more efficient. That is still the unsolved question of how to make it really, really cheap to spend Bitcoin anonymously, as cheap or even cheaper than it is to spend Bitcoin non-privately in single user transactions. But this is, in my opinion, a very solvable problem. And from all of the aspects of a high quality money, durability, divisibility, portability, blah, 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 Bitcoin had all of these checked. The one thing where it was not yet great was fungibility, right? The aspect that one coin is equal to another coin, and there's no distinguishing factor, right? Including not the distinguishing factor of which person has which coins. And that piece of information, which was revealed in the past by the default usage of Bitcoin, no longer has to be revealed if we use Bitcoin properly. Right? And well, the great thing is that we don't need to change Bitcoin for it to work, or rather, we already changed Bitcoin for it to work quite elegantly. And we're at a point where it's probably good enough, right? That even if we no longer have the privilege of improving or changing the Bitcoin consensus rules, we still have a solution that actually works. Now, if we would get to further meddle with the Bitcoin consensus rules, I'm sure we can come up with 101 improvements to the situation, but it seems it is no longer as necessary as before. And that's just extremely encouraging. So yeah, I really think we have anonymous money now.
So many questions, but I guess one is back to the, you know, I think what's on everyone's mind is like, I think everyone would agree with everything you said, but it's like, how am I to assess what privacy I'm getting? Now, that's an unanswerable question in the sense that you don't know what the people who are trying to de-anonymize you or violate your privacy are actually doing and what their capacity is and all that kind of stuff. So this is why it's kind of inevitably probabilistic. And you say, well, if someone's got their eye on me, if the government or malicious attacker has their eye on me from a KYC exchange transaction at some point, and then I put it in a Coinjoin, and now they don't know if I'm, you know, 1 or 300 of a group of people, but they still know I'm 1 of 300, and maybe that information is in some capacity useful. Maybe it's enough that they can keep tabs on me, and then even if it bifurcates from there into, you know, maybe I'm 1 of 1,000 or 1 of 10,000 or 1 of 10 million, there's still information that's potentially relatable to me. Now, off the top of my head, I don't know how that would be actionable. And certainly in a, you know, in a court of law, in that sort of environment, probably not. But if in the realm of software attacks and things like that, maybe it is. Maybe there's an attack that just, you know, is able to spread itself so wide and thin that it just casts a broad net on anyone who you might have been, and maybe it gets you, you know. So well, I guess the question is like, how do you think about, you said Bitcoin is now private. How private is it if you use it privately, you know? And I, you know, as you know, I'm a user of Wasabi Wallet. I think 2.0 is a great product. It's easy to use. I like some of the features it has for, you know, maintaining privacy, the little shield you click on to add, you know, 20 cents to make sure you're not creating any toxic change and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's very, very user friendly. But the question remains, like, when I pay for a Coinjoin, how do I look to the people that are trying to know about me?
Yeah, you put your finger exactly on the really difficult problems, right? And so first, how do we quantify anonymity? And in somewhere in the 1990s, the researchers of the Tor project wrote a phenomenal paper. It's much more a philosophical treatise than a technological one. It's called Anonymity Loves Company. And the gist of the paper is that it's all about the size of the crowd. And if you're the only person standing on stage, it's very easy to point out, hey, look at the guy there standing on the stage, right? There is just one guy. So everyone looks at you. And that means you have little privacy. Or little anonymity, more properly said. But if there's a large crowd gathering, you know, in front of the stage, then saying, hey, look at that one guy in the crowd. Well, which one guy do you mean? There's 1 out of 300. And so the larger the crowd, the larger is the possibility of a wrong guess. And let's say you guess maybe it's that one guy. Probably no, it's not, right? Because there's 299 other guys. That might as well be it. So let's say your chance of being identified is 1 in 300. That's ultimately the anonymity set. And so the task of increasing the privacy of a system then is to increase the size of the crowd, to be able to decrease the likelihood of a correct guess, something like this. And you know, if you look at a regular Bitcoin transaction, 2 inputs, 2 outputs, there's like 2 ways of interpreting that, basically. So your size of the crowd is 2, right? You know, either this one output is yours or the other, basically. And there's a very small crowd, therefore, right? It's, you know, who is it? 1 out of 2. That's not that big. And then with a Coinjoin transaction in Wasabi 2.0, let's say 300 inputs, 300 outputs, the amount of possible interpretation of what's going on here is increasing, like not just to 300, but like to billions of possible interpretations. In fact, if you look at a Wasabi Coinjoin with 300 inputs, 300 outputs, the number of ways that you could interpret it is basically 300 faculty to the power of 2, something like this, right? Like a lot, because you might have 1 input, you might have 2 inputs or 10 inputs, right, of a vast amount of different values. And there might be 1 user in this transaction. There might be 10 users. There might be 100 users. And then same on the output side. So in fact, with such a CoinJoin, just to lay out all of the possible interpretations that there could be, right? Just laying out all possible interpretations is computationally infeasible. Like a really powerful computer cannot enumerate all of the possible interpretations that a single CoinJoin transaction might have. Now, in order to perform a successful attack, you don't actually need to enumerate every possible transaction, and there are a possible interpretation. There's a lot that can be learned about a system without being able to enumerate all possible interpretations, because there might be some interpretations that are way more likely than others. But so just saying that a single round of CoinJoin increases the amount of possible interpretations substantially, like to a really, really large extent. Then the size of the crowd can even further be increased by not just doing a single round of CoinJoins, but doing multiple rounds. And especially with taking your time, right? So let's say today you make your first round of CoinJoin. That's, I don't know, let's say 1,000 interpretations. And you wait, for a couple days. But in the meantime, some of the other users of this CoinJoin go into another round of CoinJoin. And so that might be you. 1 out of the 300 people in the crowd goes into the next round. And maybe that's you, but maybe not. Right? So an attacker has to look at the next transaction as well, and the next transaction, and the next transaction, etc. So each of these times where other people make a new CoinJoin transaction, it actually increases the size of the crowd that you're hiding. Right? And then, of course, eventually you might want to do your own transaction a week later. But in between then, there were hundreds or thousands of CoinJoin transactions happening with tens of thousands of Bitcoin potentially. Right? So the amount of ambiguity, the size of the crowd of the entire CoinJoin liquidity pool, let's say, is quite staggering. Now, is it enough? That's a tough question, right? And when is it enough? And that's a tough question, especially because in order to get more, you have to pay, right? So the privacy doesn't come for free. And that's tricky because sats are valuable, right? And spending them to the miners to pay for the block space that you're purchasing, well, that hurts, right? Don't tell your heirs of how much money you've spent on block space because they'll be quite shocked with how many hundreds of thousands of Satoshis you've spent. And in the not so distant future, that might be a serious amount of wealth. So the tricky thing is we want to have not just a private system with a lot of ambiguity. We want to have a private system that's also fast and that's also cheap. And that's somewhat of the holy trinity, let's say, of designing such a system. And that's where the tricky part comes from. So I'm pretty confident that large CoinJoin or large Bitcoin transactions provide a large amount of privacy. I'm talking about many inputs, many outputs. And then doing those repeatedly exponentially increases the amount of ambiguity and therefore the anonymity set and the privacy. The leftover big problem is in doing it efficiently and knowing when to stop. So knowing when do you have enough, basically, and when are you just tossing money out of the window, basically. Extremely challenging questions.
But with something like Wasabi 2.0, remixes are free, are they not?
Well, so there's 2 parts to the fees that you have to pay. The first, and that's especially in the long run, the smaller part, is the CoinJoin coordinator fee.
Oh, I see.
And
you're still paying for the space, though.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So the problem is, so the CoinJoin coordination fee is 0.3% of the Bitcoin amount. that you're registering. And at least with the coordinator that we run, so there's a central computer, a single point of failure, let's say, that helps you and the hundreds of others of users to coordinate these transactions.
0.03, right?
No, 0.3%.
0.3, okay.
In the Wasabi 1.0 version, the calculation was way more complex, and there it was 0.003% times the anonymity set that you got.
Right.
So for a larger round, you paid more. For a smaller round, you paid less.
So now it's just a flat fee?
Exactly, yes. And that's the one-time payment that you do, right? So let's say you have 1 Bitcoin and you send it in, you pay what, 300,000 sats or 30,000 sats? Yeah, 30,000 don't do math on air. It's like doing a demo on air. You know, the demo god's not in your favor. So
300,000, point 0.3. Yeah.
Thanks. So that means then that that's a one-time fee, and that goes to the coordinator. And then, especially in Wasabi 2.0, how the system works is that you pay for exactly the amount of block space that you consume, not to the coordinator, but to the miner. Right? And the block space fee depends not on the amount of Bitcoin that you have. And you pay the same amount of fee if you send 1,000 sats or 1,000,000 Bitcoin. Ultimately, it's the same amount of data that you put on the blockchain, and you pay for the amount of data, not for the amount of money. And then the question of how often and how much block space do you consume depends on your privacy level. And if you want to optimize for speed and cost, it's kind of okay to do just 1 round of Coinjoins. And you pay maybe 2 or 3 times as much block space than you otherwise would. So it's rather cheap. But if you're, let's say, paranoid and you really want to increase the ambiguity of which UTXOs are yours by a substantial amount, then doing multiple rounds, at least 2, 5, 10. I think like the average remix count is something like 40. So the average Wasabi user right now does 40 rounds of remixes, basically, which it's actually kind of insane. So that's especially if you optimize for privacy, and you can do that in the Coinjoin settings, and to optimize either for speed or for cost or for privacy. And the behavior and the cost and the privacy gain is very different for each of these. So there, it depends a lot. Right?
What would you say, you know, doing maybe user research would be the motivation? I mean, a specific motivation, because you might just be a user. It's like, well, I don't care, you know, I'm just going to remix forever because that's how I get down. But so let's take an example, right? During the truckers' protest, were someone to say, buy Bitcoin on a KYC exchange, do 1 mix, let's say they're in an anonymity set of 300 people, and say, okay, cool, government's not going to be able to know who I was, so I'm going to send this money to the truckers. Now, maybe it's the case that, you know, that anonymity set was not large enough, and at some point they get a knock on the door and say, hey, we know you were within a group of 300 people that may have sent money to the truckers, and we'd like you to come in for questioning, and we'd like to subpoena your computer and all this kind of stuff. And so in a case like that, their understanding of that being sufficient would probably be erroneous. That probably wouldn't be right. And so obviously it's, you know, your privacy is depending on what you're using that privacy for, I guess, or what you're trying to, you know, protect yourself against. And so it comes back to this question, like, I mean, I guess, what are the main threats? Well, that's too broad of a question, but I mean, it's tricky how one is to assess how much privacy they need, right? So let's just say this hypothetical trucker donator person, it's like, what would have been sufficient for them to donate to the truckers? Now, maybe if they're in a second and a third mix, and as you say, that, you know, exponentially increases the anon set, and now they're hiding in a crowd of 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000. Well, the government's not going to be able to round up 1,000,000 people and question them and subpoena them. For that use case, you're probably good. But, you know, how is one to make such a determination?
Yeah, really, really difficult. So the first question to answer this is who is the attacker? Right?
Yeah.
I think it's even off this Anonymity Loves Company paper, but it might be a different academic paper that talks about this, that there are basically 4 different archetypes of attackers. Right? There are local attackers that have a view over a small part of the network. And then there are global attackers, which have a view, the anonymizing view over the entire network. And then we have passive attackers, and who just eavesdrop basically, and you know, see what's going on from the outside basically. And we have active attackers, people who are actually, in our example, partaking in the Coinjoin. Right, the attacker adds inputs and outputs to the Coinjoin transaction. So if we're talking about a global active adversary, you're probably fucked. That's like the end boss of the end boss, because he has a view over the entire network globally, and he is actively interfering with the traffic, right? And can actively make choices or ban people, etc., to perform targeted attacks. That's, if that is the adversary, there's almost nothing that can be done about this with almost no anonymity network. Like Tor is broken, right? If that is the case, if we have an adversary that can see the entire Tor network and de-anonymize the entire traffic, and he is running all of the Tor routing nodes in between and can selectively drop packages from the victim, for example, there is no way to prevent against that. But the big question then is, what's the price for being a global active adversary? And that is a really, really interesting question. And Adam Back, right? Hashcash, verifiable costliness, right? If it is expensive to use a system, it is expensive to be a global active adversary. Because in order to be a global active adversary, you have to pay the expensive cost every time, very frequently and very often. And so just to put some numbers on this, the total amount of Bitcoin in Wasabi throughout a month is in the hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, right? That has to be locked up for a certain amount of time where it is unconfirmed, so to perform an active attack on Wasabi globally would require an ungodly amount of money, and the opportunity cost that comes with that. It's not just about having hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. It's about forgoing the investment opportunity that so much money could bring to you, because you cannot invest your money, you cannot lend your money, you have to keep your money saved, so to say, and you know, have it liquid and available to perform these Coinjoins. So there's the opportunity cost of the market rate of return, or the interest rate, basically. And then the second thing is you have to pay the mining fee and the coordinator fee, right? So the amount, let me quickly try to calculate the amount of money that we spend. It's about like $300,000 per month just on block space cost, right? That you would have to pay to the miners. And since we can presume that miners are quite decentralized and not just owned by a single person who also happens to be the attacker, that would be an actual cost, right? Where the attacker has to send a lot of money to the miners, who is not he. And so to not just make this attack one time, but to keep it up and running, not just for 1 month, but for years, is a serious amount of cost. So to some funny extent, the fact that Bitcoin isn't scalable and therefore quite expensive to transact means we're pretty resistant against global active adversaries, because we're just talking about an insane amount of cost. That sure, maybe some 3-letter agencies have infinite budget to perform such attacks. It seems unlikely to me, though. And another interesting thing that global active adversaries are lacking is is that there might not be just one single global active adversary. Right? There might be two different three-letter agencies that want to perform this attack, and they might be from two different jurisdictions or two different political parties that don't like each other and that don't want to support each other. So as one attacker enters and the second attacker enters, now they no longer know which coins are from the second attacker versus from the victim. There is, of course, some incentives and some game theoretical nuances here that cooperation among attackers is beneficial to the attackers. But now we have to assume global active cooperative adversaries. And that just adds more and more cost to a successful attack.
Is there a reason, so in the current Wasabi wallet, you know, you can have auto mix on, or you can do it manually, and then it says, you know, a percentage of your coins that are in the wallet that are private. As you're describing all this, it makes me think, like, is there a reason you don't state, like, you are now 1 in 10,000 level of privacy, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion? Is there a reason why it's a percentage and not that? Because presumably that would give someone like, okay, well, if I'm going to donate money to the truckers, I want to be 1 in a million because I know that, you know, they can't round us all up. But if it's if I'm protecting myself from, I don't know, some quantum computer, I want to be 1 in a trillion, you know, sort of group. So is there a reason why you don't highlight it or state it that way?
Because I don't have so much money to buy to generate a black hole, because inside a black hole you can compute a lot of information, right? And you need to compute a lot of information to come up with this number. Like even under very restrictive, so like we tried this, right? We had a theoretical Coinjoin. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was 100 inputs, 100 outputs. And we assumed that every user had exactly 5 inputs, something like this, and that he did not get more than 4 outputs or something. And we try to enumerate all of the possible sub-transactions that are within this one large transaction. And it after days of computing, that rather modern high-performant laptop still didn't finalize. And this is under these heavy constraints. But in reality, Wasabi, for example, the choice of how many inputs does your wallet register is a random choice between 1 and 10. In BTC Pay Server, for example, that random choice is between 1 and 30. And so if you truly want to enumerate all possible input groups that possibly could belong to someone, you need to find all possible groups of unknown number of users having unknown number of coins. Just that alone, right, to find out which inputs might belong to the same person is it's just exponentially complexity blow up quite quickly.
So when it says 100% private, what is the metric behind, you know, under the surface that is allowing that percentage to be stated, you know, versus 80% versus 90%? Like, what does 100% privacy mean as far as the software of the wallet is concerned?
Yes. So it's basically because it is computationally infeasible to have a hard and correct statement about the anonymity set gained, we are lowballing it, basically. We're making extremely conservative estimates in the sense of we only count the number of outputs of exactly the same value. Right? So let's say there's 300 outputs and 10 of them are worth 1 Bitcoin, and you have 1 of them. And your anonymity score for this output worth 1 Bitcoin would be 10. The amount of possible interpretations of, let's say you have this given input worth 5 Bitcoin and something, and which of the possible outputs is yours? It's way more than 10. Right? It's into the hundreds or thousands, depending on the exact case. But we assume, or we calculate with only the amount that is very easily to compute. And that's what's the count, the number of outputs of exactly the same value. And if and that's well, the reason why we chose this is because it's a theoretically sound way, and it's easy to compute. It's not an accurate number. It cannot be an accurate number, but it is a useful number, let's say. And so this is basically our anonymity scoring mechanism, the number of equal value outputs. And there's a lot of nuances in how exactly we calculate that number. I mean, that's why we have software, you know, it's quite complex, and the computer does a good job at it, and me explaining would do a really bad job. Look at the code if you're really interested. But ultimately, it's the number of equal amount outputs. So that's the anonymity scoring metric. And this metric is not a global metric. This is a local metric, because every Wasabi Wallet client calculates this metric for himself uniquely. Like one interesting example is, let's say we have 10 outputs worth exactly 1 Bitcoin, and you have one of them. So you would calculate that your anonymity score is 10, right? Because there seem to be 9 other outputs. But let's presume that there's a second user, a whale, and he has 9 Bitcoin in this round, and they are split up into each one Bitcoin on the output side, right? So this one user knows that out of these 10 coins, I have 9 of them. So the whale user, he would give each of these outputs the anonymity score of 1. Mm-hmm. And so the anonymity score for each output is different depending on which other inputs and outputs are part of that user's wallet. But only the individual user knows about which inputs and which outputs belong to him. So the anonymity score is inherently unique to each wallet or each user. That's how we calculate the number. And then the question is, when do we stop? What value do we have to hit in this anonymity scoring system for us to think this is good enough privacy? And in the context of Wasabi, we have a default, basically. It's important for software to have good defaults. And we realized that we cannot have a single default for everyone, because some people want to have it really fast, some other people want to have it as cheap as possible, and some others are paranoid and want to get maximum privacy regardless of how much it costs or how long it takes. Right? So we basically chose 3 different defaults, and we abstracted that in the privacy profiles. And so you can optimize for cost, where the anonymity score target is 5. You can optimize for speed, where the anonymity score target is also 5, or you can optimize for privacy, where the anonymity score target is a random choice between 27 and 50, I think, something like this. Right?
Which
so if you
means 100% privacy would mean between 27 and 50 equal value outputs?
No, the 100% privacy basically is derived in first looking at all of the UTXOs that you have in your wallet. Say you have 10 UTXOs, worth in total 20 Bitcoin, whatever. And for each of these UTXOs, we check what's the anonymity score. Right? And that depends on which Coinjoin transactions did you participate, with how many inputs, how many outputs did you get, what was the value of the outputs of other users, etc. All of this is being considered, and then each output has its own unique anonymity score. Let's say the anonymity score is 2, 3, 5, 20, 25, 50, whatever, for each of these 10 UTXOs that you have. And now we check your anonymity score target is 5. Okay. And then which UTXO has a larger anonymity score more than 5? So for example, the coin with anonymity score 20 would be then considered private. And the coin with anonymity score 10 would be considered private. But if you have, let's say, 4 anonymity score on a UTXO, that's considered semi-private. It's not above your target yet, but it's also more than 1. And because a UTXO with an anonymity score of 1, that's considered not private. So basically, if the anonymity score is 1, we consider it as not private. If the anonymity score is higher than 1, but below your anonymity score target, then it's semi-private. And if the coin is above the anonymity score target, it's considered private. And now the percentage number that you see in the user interface is basically out of all the coins that you have and all the value that is there, what's the percentage amount of the total wallet balance that is above the target? And there's some weighted average for the semi-private things, semi-private coins. But so ultimately you could kind of think of is if you have 10 Bitcoin in your wallet and your privacy level is 70%, then you have UTXOs worth 7 Bitcoin, which might be, I don't know, 5 different UTXOs. But these 7 Bitcoin worth of UTXOs are above the privacy level or at the anonymity score target of 5, versus 3 Bitcoin are in 1 or below the anonymity score target of 5. So 1 to 4 of anonymity score. But basically, if you see 70% private at 10 Bitcoin wallet balance, that means you can make private payments of 7 Bitcoin worth. And if you would want to make a 10 Bitcoin worth payment, it would not be considered private. Again, not considered private in the extremely naive and lowball and conservative estimates that we can easily compute. If an attacker could actually break your input to output linkage here is a whole different question, but for simplicity's sake, we assume he can, and we don't allow you and we don't make it easy for you to spend that money.
Yeah, I think I understand that. And I guess for me, it just keeps coming back to how much privacy do you need?
Yeah.
So there's the kind of like, I guess, ambiguous privacy where you don't want to stand out in a crowd. You want to be in some kind of a crowd just for general avoidance of threats. But then if you're thinking about doing something that, based on your circumstance or your jurisdiction is quote unquote risky, again, to use the trucker protest, then you have to be far more thoughtful. And I guess, even though I appreciate your answer, it's kind of tough for even a person like that to derive, a good answer for themselves. Because like, one, they don't know how much, how much privacy they need, like what is the government doing to surveil anyone who's sending Bitcoin transactions to whatever address that the truckers have put up or whatever. So they don't know that. And they also don't know the lengths they're willing to go to, hunt down, their address if they do make a donation. So it's like, it's this, it's somewhat amorphous to determine how much privacy you need. I think everyone realizes that some is better than none, but I guess that the devil is in the details there where how much do you need? But this, don't want to take up too much more of your time, but there's basically 2 more things I want to cover before we shut it down. And one is that the Canadian trucker thing does make me think, and this is another thing we discussed in the fall. I think was it around this time last year, March last year, where the whole blacklisting thing happened? Was that March of 2022 or April of 2022 or something?
Yeah, it was early spring. I think March is where we announced and made that decision.
And so, again, to use this trucker example, maybe they have privacy, right? So they were able to make a donation and no one came after them or followed up. But maybe the degree of, surveillance that the Canadian government was using, they just somehow took note. Maybe they, again, I don't know how it was actually set up. So I don't know if this data was available, but hypothetically, let's just say, oh, they noticed this coin was donated to the truckers. And so, now that coin is blacklisted and, it's tagged and all that kind of stuff. And into the future, it becomes maybe harder for the truckers to spend or harder for the truckers to anonymize and get some privacy on for themselves, that whole thing. Now, so, I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast on the blacklisting thing. But I guess basically my question is, how's it been operating? Because you guys came out and you said, basically, as far as you've explained it to me, we're going to be employing a chain analysis company. We're going to send them, all the addresses prior to doing a mix. You've explained to me that none of that information is information that they wouldn't have already had because they're already surveilling the blockchain for obvious imprints of Coinjoins. And if there's any blacklisted UTXOs, then we're just going to not allow them to be included in the Coinjoin. Now, Twitter is a crazy place and you hear all sorts of stuff, and people were saying, no, it's not just that. Like, Wasabi is going to penalize people after the fact, or they're going to follow up with charges or whatever stuff. But as far as I understand it, the blacklisted coins just don't get into the Coinjoin, and there may be some restriction on the wallet thereafter. But can you just tell me, I'm sure you've explained it in a lot of podcasts, so you don't need to explain the full, like, how you got there, but how has the implementation of that been? Like, are you blacklisting a shit ton of UTXOs? Just kind of give me a year on what the status of things are.
Yeah, this was a quite interesting and difficult move, and stirred up a lot of controversy. But again, it's, I think, a move where having strong principles helped a lot with the clarity for me of whether or not this is a good move. And especially the cypherpunk principles. If to quote, right, if two parties have some sort of dealings, then each has a memory of their interaction. Each party can speak about their own memory of this. How could anyone prevent it? So again, cypherpunks try to build systems that utilize the minimum amount of information necessary to perform that service or to partake in the system. And with Wabi-Sabi, we have built the most anonymous coordination system, Coinjoin coordination system, where the least amount of information has to be revealed to the coordinator. So for example, the information of which inputs belong to the same user, right? Or how many inputs does a single user have? Or even how many users are there in this transaction? And the same thing for the output side. Which outputs belong to the same user? How many outputs belong to any single user? And how many users are on the output side? The information is hidden from the coordinator. Clients do not reveal this information to the coordinator. And whenever information is not revealed, it cannot be spied upon, and there can be no decision made on that information. Or none of that information can be forwarded to someone else. Nobody can talk about something that he doesn't know. But despite the immense progress that Wabi-Sabi is in terms of an anonymity network or anonymity protocol, there is still some information that has to be revealed. And even after lots of thinking of how we could remove this piece of information, I still don't know how. So if any of the audience knows it, please tell me. But the question of which input is being registered, and what's the specific input that is currently being registered by a user, that is information that I do not know how to hide. And it seems to me that it is a necessity of the Bitcoin protocol, and therefore the Coinjoin coordination protocol, that the user has to reveal this information. And whenever information has to be revealed or is revealed, then it can be talked about and decisions can be made about it. So to how it technically works, a Coinjoin coordination has basically 3 rounds of the protocol. The first round is the input registration phase. And here's where users say, hey, that's the coin that I want to put on the input side of this transaction. The second round is output registration. That's where the client says, hey, this is the address and the amount that I want to put on the output side of the transaction. And lastly is the signature phase. Right? So after we have all of the inputs, all of the outputs, then all of the inputs must sign the exact same transaction with their private keys. Those are the 3 rounds, right? Now, during input registration, right, as people say, hey, that's the coin that I want to register on the input side, etc., as the coordinator knows this, he can talk about this information to other people, which is what we do, right? We turn around and have an API with some chain surveillance detective, let's say, and we ask them, hey, this coin, what is the metadata about the coin? And we're specifically interested in the metadata regarding, has this coin been involved with violent activity, right? Is this a coin coming from investment fraud or from credit card scamming or from slave trade or terrorist financing, etc. These types of metadata is what we're interested in. And the reason why we're interested is, to be honest, I don't want to help people who stole money. Right? And if there's a decently good chance for them stealing, for this coin being stolen, then I just don't want to deal with those persons, let's say. Also, another thing that we check is for sanctions list, right? Because sanctions are very much enforced. And when you sell bubblegum to a sanctioned individual, that can be enforced and is criminal act. And that is a, let's say, business risk that I'm not willing to take. And these are the pieces of metadata that we have defined as a CoinJoin coordinator as the desire to be put on the blacklist. So it's not that the detective says that's a bad coin, don't put it in for arbitrary reasons that are not explained to us. It's that the coordinator has a certain set of metadata that he does not like, and is chosen by us, basically, and we just basically trust that service provider to have an accurate representation of that. So yes, the service provider might say, hey, this is a coin related to credit card scamming, but actually it's not, right? And he just falsely puts a coin into this bucket of metadata. That could happen and probably is happening, right? So there is a rate of false positives where a coin is being attributed to this bad metadata, where in reality it actually is not. That is quite unfortunate, and an inherent limitation in the system of detective work. I guess sometimes you make mistakes. And simultaneously, there might be coins that actually do come from criminal activity that do not have the metadata flag. Why? Because it's actually quite difficult to be a global active detective that catches every case of criminality ever happening on this planet, right? Especially if the criminals are smart and use technology properly. Like if you generate a new address every time, like how's anyone to link multiple activity to the same user, etc. So there's just a lot of inherently difficult tasks of doing this properly. And so nevertheless, after we have received this metadata check of what's the metadata on each coin, we make that decision of, do we allow the coin to register and to continue further, or do we return an error code to the client, basically saying API request denied because of these reasons, then that's basically it, right? So because the CoinJoin coordination service is non-custodial, we cannot freeze the user's money or take the user's money, etc. All we can do is deny service to any specific UTXO for whatever reason. Right? That's basically the gist of how it works technically.
But and if let's say if I have 10 UTXOs and one is tagged or blacklisted, and doesn't get included in the CoinJoin, that doesn't stop me using my client from CoinJoining anything else, right? It doesn't block service to any UTXOs that are not flagged or tagged. Is that correct?
Exactly, because your wallet does not tell us that these 10 coins belong to the same person.
Right. I guess, perhaps the most obvious, glitch in this is that you're necessarily relying on the authorities of the world today, government, law enforcement, to define all the things you mentioned. So yes, in principle, I'm with you. Like, you don't want to do business with someone who is a terrorist, right? But you and I think of terrorists as, someone who's going to go kill innocent people. But in Canada a year ago, a terrorist might have easily been defined as a trucker who lost his job because he didn't want to take a forced medical treatment and is just trying to feed his family by some donated sats, and now they become a terrorist. So anyone can be claimed an enemy of the state effectively, or you or I might someday find ourselves on a, I don't know, some sort of finance watch list because we're involved in what someone else defines as criminal or immoral behavior, when you and I might deem it the exact opposite. And so you're relying on definitions of kind of upside down clown world to execute on what, I think a lot of people, even though initially maybe it was a bit of a shock, because this whole like open source everything is no restrictions, but from an ethical basis, I can see as a coordinator being a business saying, look, if we knew for certain, like thought experiment, if we knew for certain that someone was an actual terrorist murdering innocent people, yes, of course, I wouldn't want to do business with them. Just as if I owned a gun store and I knew that's what they were, and of course the devil's in the details, because how often do you know for sure something? But if I knew that was the case, I wouldn't want to sell them a gun. I'd probably want to, I'd probably want to stop them in some way, Yeah. And so the absolute ethical, all information being known, the ethical consideration, I think is fairly valid, and I think people can understand it. The problem is when the definitions of those things is being controlled by someone other than yourself, because of course you couldn't. I mean, you're not Interpol or whatever. You don't have that kind of information on everyone. But again, Interpol is probably, probably will define things, or the governments behind those institutions would define things differently than you or I. And again, in today's clown world as it is, we see innumerable instances of that. And so that, I think, is part of the reason why so many people were maybe disappointed to see that implementation, because it was kind of acquiescing to the perverted or distorted definitions of bad guy that, current authority structures in the world today have been propagating. And I think a lot of us probably disagree with them.
Yeah, and I totally get your argument. And I think it's very valid when we're talking about sanctions. Because we, or the company, does not define what a sanctioned individual is. OFAC does that, and European, Australian regulators do that. And sanction policy is, even though understandable in a lot of regards, if we're talking about macro politics, it is quite against the ethical understanding of property rights. So yes, the definition of what is a sanctioned entity is up to the whim of some bureaucrats, and that is a serious problem. But let's say violating the edicts of the OFAC sanction board comes with serious consequences, and that like we saw that, for example, where all of a sudden all Russian citizens are put on a sanction list. Like that's bonk shit. Like that's crazy. That's insane. But well, there are consequences of not doing that, right? Or of not following those set of rules, even when you're not an American business. So that is unfortunate, and a bug in the political system right now. But I would disagree in terms of the violent criminals, because those are, as far as I understand it, not a legal requirement for us to do. That is what we do out of our own right. And so it's also something new that I learned, but that these chain surveillance providers give you a list of hundreds, like 300, 500 different metadata categories, including things like this is related to gun trade or credit card scamming, or this is more than $1,000 worth, right? So there's a lot of different, or this was sent on a Tuesday, right? These are all metadata buckets that you can click and select as being part of your risk management policy, basically. And which of these buckets we choose, that is indeed up to us. And so far, nobody has forced us to pick any specific of these ones, again, other than sanctions. So the attack I'm more concerned about is that the service provider, the surveillance firm, the detective, basically, is maliciously adding UTXOs or addresses in a category where they know it's actually not the case. Right? They know that this is not a, I don't know, child sex trafficker, but it's some political activist who's on a list of undesirable people. So we just, accuse him of raping little girls and put him there, and that's it. And all of a sudden he will be barred from all the entrepreneurs who just don't want to do business with sex traffickers or whatever it is, right? That is a serious problem. And I think, or I guess the way around this is with competition, right? If there are certain providers that do this, and it comes to light after some, repeated interaction and review of the process, then there's the opportunity to switch to a provider. It's somewhat scary to see of how many of these providers there are. There are hundreds of them, right? It's not just a couple companies, hundreds of companies with an enormous amount of funding, each of them.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot, unfortunately, quite a lot of competition here. Also, fortunately, right? Because that means that the service in general tends to become better and better across time.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you believe that Bitcoin is truly anti-fragile, then having the forces, the threat of so many surveillance companies always on it, basically incentivizing and forcing it to adapt in reference to them, then perhaps you'd have to define that attack like any other as a good thing, as kind of counterintuitive as it might be. But my rebuttal to what you said would be, yes, of course you choose, what you want to screen for. But as you say, and I don't even think it needs to be necessarily, malicious, but what determines which tags wind up in which buckets? And I presume that the chain analysis companies are just relying on the law enforcement authorities in whatever jurisdiction they're in, because what else would they use, or at least that would be a part of what they would use. And that's where we get into the hairy territory of, we live in clown world, and anyone who is, against the regime or counter status quo, or if you said men aren't women though on Twitter at some point, you may wind up in a bucket and your economic freedom may be impaired as a result of that. Now, so, I mean, that's the real sticky point here. It's like, again, on a thought experiment, ethical grounds, I can totally see it, but there's almost like an Oracle problem, which is like, well, who says that this person is what bucket they're in is saying they are? And that's the real problem. Now, I've seen it framed, and it's easy to kind of consider this like, well, maybe it's kind of a bit of a service. Now, I don't want to go too far because it's a complicated situation. But if I have 10 UTXOs, and in my attempt to put them in a Coinjoin, one is returned back to me saying, hey, like, you're on a terrorist watch list somewhere or something like that, or you don't even get the information. But let's say it's denied for some reason. Maybe I go elsewhere with that UTXO or try to, get privacy over it. But there's surely some value in knowing that it was blacklisted somewhere. I guess part of the problem is that at some point, presumably every UTXO, I mean, if every UTXO is being effectively tagged with metadata, and if the powers that be, if this system that Bitcoin is basically a challenge to, or the antithesis of, is increasingly going to try to cast a broader and broader and broader net, then at some point it seems that everything will be blacklisted until Bitcoin is just outlawed entirely, and it has to. Now, maybe that never happens, but of course, a lot of us have have thought this out. Like, what happens when it's banned from countries, KYC on and off ramps are shut down? The full-on attack that many have anticipated would someday happen with Bitcoin. Then everything would be blacklisted, but then we all probably have bigger fish to fry than and Wasabi would have an existential question to say, well, are we going to continue to go this way, or are we going to go underground effectively? So, it's I guess my point is I see I see why the criticism came, because it's very anti-ethos of, you know, open networks and open source software and that kind of stuff. I can see the pure ethical justification from where you're coming from. I can see the problems with it when it's actually implemented. So not just in the, you know, the pure argument of it. And then with the, as far as the sanctions part of it is concerned, you know, I'm of two minds. Like, one, you know, instinctively, I want to say, fuck you, you know, to everyone. Don't tell me what to do. This is kind of what this whole ethos of freedom is about. And I want to do whatever I want with my money, and I'll make the ethical decisions, right? That's my right. And that's my responsibility. But the other one is like, we live in, I mean, part of the reason why we're here, why all of us are interested in Bitcoin, is because we live in a system that is not Bitcoin, right? That doesn't have the attributes of Bitcoin. We live in highly controlled, highly censored, highly surveilled, highly imposed upon in many different ways world, no matter where you live. And so some people, you know, I've heard some criticism of you guys being like, you know, you're feeding the beast, basically. You know, you're paying the chain analysis, which is, you know, paying government or whatever the arrangement is. And that's obviously true, even if you accept, or especially if you don't accept, the anti-fragile argument. But if I'm being fair, right, if I'm not being instinctively emotional and just, you know, being angry, but if I'm being fair about everything, it's like, well, most of us pay taxes. And so like, why do you pay taxes? Well, you pay taxes. You don't want to pay taxes, obviously. And I'm sure we all think we pay more than we should. But to the extent that you're legally obligated to, you live in a jurisdiction where you have such obligations, you do. And that's because you don't want a gun shoved in your face and don't want to be thrown in a prison. So like, you are feeding the beast, but you're making a trade-off to say, well, yes, I'm doing something I don't want to do, feeding the beast, but it's enabling me to have a certain degree of freedom otherwise. And I, you know, of course, I hate that we as a humanity are in that situation where we have to make that decision. And alluding, you know, referring to our conversation in the first half of this podcast, that's why we're here, right? So that those sorts of trade-offs don't have to be made in the future. But again, if I'm being fair to all parties, if part of your argument is this was a trade-off we made to try to permit us to continue our work for longer, or to hire people in different jurisdictions, or, you know, to better serve the cause of creating this solution, you know, this open source software without having our employees jailed. And again, that in itself is an assumption. You know, you would know better than me whether it's a good one or a bad one. But again, it's defensible in some way, I guess, is what I'm saying, because most of us, if not all of us, make some sort of a trade-off judgment like that in our daily affairs, where we want maximal freedom and self-determination, but there are forces that we have to contend with, and we all have to decide how and when we contravene them and what the consequences are. And so if that's part of the motivation, then, you know, it's not without its own logic, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, definitely. I'm with you there. And it's about focus as well. Right? There's like, in your lifetime, you have the chance of maybe like 1, 2 like big projects to tackle holistically enough to make a meaningful difference. Trying to fix everything all at once is probably going to fail, and you're not even going to succeed with improving one aspect of it. We've cut ourselves a pretty big chunk of work. Like trying to have anonymous inflation-resistant money is a engineering, philosophical, economical development task already, right? That's like, and I have, you know, Wasabi now has like 40 paid contributors full-time, and like that's not enough by a factor of 100. You know, I need 4,000 to fix this problem properly and with a reasonable time frame. So that's just one small problem, right? There's a lot of other big problems that you mentioned, right? For example, OFACs or OFAC sanctions, right? That's a big problem. Like, we as a human species have to have to address this problem, and that is a work for 50,000 people of 20 years of work in 100 different jurisdictions. It's an extremely valuable work, and I applaud anyone who would tackle it. But that just cannot be done all at once by the same group of people. So it's about being practical to a large extent, and being here in this weird twilight zone where it seems we're coming out of the dark ages and hopefully into enlightenment. That I'm hoping is the last time that weird actions like these have to be taken, and hopefully that with the technologies that we create, at least the problems will be different in the future, and well, I'm sure that some of these problems, as we've spoken about, will not leave us. This is just seems to be part of human existence, and then we will see of how we address them in the future. But trying to spread ourselves too thin and trying to as Knut Svanholm once said to me, like, you have to be good at a hill to die on picking. Because there's really not many hills you can die on. There's like one. So and for me it's about the economic and psychological.
Well, there's a lot of hills you only get to die once, I guess, is the point. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you got to pick, and you better pick wisely. And for me currently, the technological and economical and philosophical challenges of anonymous money it's already a huge chunk, It's like still struggling hard with quite a lot of dedicated people working on it. Yeah. So scoping and focusing is, I think, a virtue that a lot of us lack, especially as Bitcoin generalists who are just curious and fascinated about all of the topics and have a really loud opinion about many, many things. That is certainly amiable, but focus is important. And I think a lot of the learnings that I had in Wasabi on numerous fronts was the importance of focus, and that we focus on the tech, and yeah, we want to keep doing this for a long time and at scale, right? And that was always the case. Like the founders of the project realized that this is a huge project. Like this is decades of work of the smartest people that we can get together on it, and we if you want to, well, do things the pirate way, let's say, then you need to be extremely careful, and it tends to work better at a small scale, right? Like a small petty criminal or thief or something gets away with it, but running a huge organized crime syndicate is all of a sudden a lot more difficult, as by analogy. So we need more people working on this problem. We need more privacy enthusiasts having the financial stability and the peace of mind of being able to focus on solving this problem, without the fear of going to jail. There's numerous people who declined or stopped working on the project because of the perceived risk of being involved with anything that touches human freedom and individual privacy. Like, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're all a bit of the crazy weirdos on the sideline having really crazy ideas of things like humans should be free and let's not steal from each other. That's a niche opinion, So, and yeah, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of strategy in, I think, everything, like in everything that a lot of different people do here. And I think Bitcoiners are in general quite cautious and deliberate people. And yeah, that is, yeah. So
but also,
I'm
also very principled, which I think that's why this became a thing, and that's why I love this space so much, because, imperfect as I am and as we all are, it helps elucidate or give greater clarity on which principles and values you ought to be subjecting yourself to. And that's been a big part of the transformations that we've been discussing throughout this conversation. And so when something first comes up that seems to contradict that, like there's a reflexive reaction, you know, and I'm generally speaking, I'm not on the ends justify the means sort of side of things, because I think that that's a very slippery slope and it devolves very quickly. And so another way of saying that is just, you know, being principled and acting in accord with that. But as you say, I mean, there's an element of lose a battle to win the war strategizing as well, which is slightly different. You know, that's not the same thing as the ends justifying the means. It's different. And you know, so in any battle or in any confrontation, like the right move, or whether you're playing chess or whatever, is not to just storm the battlefield all at once with all of your resources and die a heroic death, you know, because you end up dying on that hill. You don't achieve the outcome, which was more human freedom and sovereignty and liberation and truth and all of these things. And so it's very easy, I guess, is part of the point I'm making, to oversimplify things. But then also to bring it back to reality. Like I said, I mean, I strive to hold myself to standards of principles and values that I deem to be the most valid ones. But when I look at my life, there are areas where I've resigned myself, you know, to acquiescing to something that I'm against, you know, and it's because the consequences of contravening whatever that might be were too great for me to accept in the moment. Like, you know, to put it in terms, I didn't want to yet die on that hill, because I thought, you know, there was more that I could do before making the ultimate sacrifice, basically. And you know, I'm sure it sounds a little bit like I'm coming to your guys' defense here, and I'm just basically I'm sharing what my thought process around it has been, because as you know, when we spoke in the fall, I was torn on the ethical dynamic that was at play. And, you know, since then I've thought about it a lot. And, you know, I think it's an imperfect solution, as we said. I think, you know, it's not achieving, you know, purely the aim that it was set out to. But again, I can see the rationale insofar as, you know, living to fight another day and, you know, perhaps losing a battle to ultimately win the war. I can, you know, that's not without its rationale for one to take that perspective on it. And, you know, and finally, you know, I very much appreciate what you guys have built and are doing. And like I said, you know, I'm a user, and I'm glad that what you've built exists and that it's constantly being refined, developed, and improved. And that it's open source software, you know, so people can use it however they like, and people can, hopefully in the future, there'll be coordinators that have a different offering, let's say, that do things differently, and then the market can choose amongst the options, you know, which ones they prefer. And, you know, I think that's going to be a necessity anyways, because, you know, and again, this would fall into the criticism bucket of what you guys have done. Regardless of the overtures that you make, it's likely the case that if things play out the way that we've always kind of thought they would, that someone's going to come down on what you're doing at some point anyways. Maybe you've bought some time with this move, maybe you haven't, you know, who knows how to assess that sort of thing. But I'm you know, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, you know, if the and maybe we're still in the honeymoon period, and it's you know, it's the next cycle or a couple more years, but before the hammer really falls down on Bitcoin. And I hope it never does. You know, I hope there's just this, you know, weird transformation from that old, you know, immoral system into the Bitcoin one, and that would be great. But it's also perhaps equally likely the case that there's a big backlash at some point, and in which case, I doubt it'll matter. You know, that such gestures were made to try to avoid, you know, the eye of Sauron coming down on you, let's say, because at that point, it's going to probably be a dragnet approach. Like, anyone who's even touched this stuff, you're shut down, you're done, you're charged or whatever. And so to the extent that I know, you know that, and I know the people that work on the project probably feel at least some version of that. You know, I appreciate the courage and dedication it takes to persist anyways, because as you say, I mean, you know, a number of people, I know some people that have dropped out of such projects just at the first sight of anything that might come at them in the future, not even, you know, only being at arm's length. And so the people that are principally committed to, you know, fighting this war, albeit strategically, let's say, I have tremendous respect for, you know, so I appreciate your and everyone else's efforts very much.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that a lot too. And you know, there's like I'm extremely thankful for the reaction that we got, because it was my initial reaction too when this idea was proposed, because there's numerous reasons of why this isn't a perfect idea. Yet nevertheless, and this ties back to our earlier of having principles and living by them. When you actually think about this based on the principles that we have, there is nothing wrong with the move that we did on numerous levels, neither on the principles of freedom nor on the principles of the cypherpunks. Right? And this is basically just a way of saying that once you have principles that you have extremely carefully considered and chosen and rigorously reviewed, then you can rely on them in really turbulent times with extremely difficult decisions. Because if a decision is okay, given the set of principles that you've rigorously reviewed, then do the decision, and the consequences will be the least bad that they possibly could be. You know, yes, maybe it's a really fucking difficult decision, but what else do you have to guide you if not those principles?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a broader point for life generally, and which, you know, is kind of the hack that we were referring to earlier. It's like the greater clarity you get on those principles, then when you're in those situations where you don't know what to do, at a minimum, you have something to help guide you to make them. And, you know, they may not always, well, it reminds me of Peterson. You know, he says, speak the truth, and the best thing that whatever happens is the best thing that can happen because of the validity of using truth as your guide. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of nuance there as well, because, you know, we could easily dream up thought exercises where, you know, the one that often comes up is, well, if the Nazis knocked on your door and you were hiding a bunch of Jews under your floorboards and they said, "You're hiding any Jews in here, sir?" Well, you would say no, and that wouldn't be the truth. But, you know, in one of these conversations I've had with someone recently, they were saying like, yeah, but which truth are you most trying to uphold or cohere with? The truth that every life has value, or the, you know, the truth that everyone is deserving of freedom, or the truth of that man trying to take someone's life? You know, so it's almost like, and that's where wisdom, I think, comes in, discerning, like decoding the situation so you can discern what it is you're speaking truth in reference to, or what it is you're trying to cohere with, the principle you're trying to identify in any given situation, and being true to that, not necessarily just you know, answering any given question with the, you know, the objective truth of the situation. It's deeper than that, and that's why these topics like philosophy and ethics and religion are so complex and rich, because if it were so easy to decide, you know, the ethical, the right thing to do in any given situation just on the kind of the material inputs of that situation, then, well, we wouldn't be human, I guess, in a sense. And that wisdom and all the other principles maybe wouldn't have the power and the usefulness that they do. In any case, Max, we went way over here. I think I might split this episode into two parts, where we kind of dig into the wasabi part of things and where we were kind of just riffing beforehand. The last question, and I promise I'll let you go, is just I referenced earlier that a lot of other solutions seem to be emerging in the marketplace: Arc, Cashew, eCash, sidechains, and stuff like that, which have relevance for privacy. Is any of that, I mean, what does all that mean to you? Excited about it? Has potential? Just would love to hear your thoughts.
I'm excited about anything that makes a progress towards human freedom and individual privacy. So all of these projects you mentioned are awesome, and it's great that people are working on them. In terms of practical solutions, a lot of that will work together nicely, but I think so far nothing replaces Coinjoin. Coinjoin is like a base layer technology. It's inherently a blockchain based technology, and so basically whenever you make blockchain transactions, you will want to do them in a Coinjoin. And that can be to make a payment on chain, do it in a Coinjoin, right? Or you want to send money to yourself, like from one wallet to another, do it in a Coinjoin. If you want to open a Lightning Network channel or close a Lightning Network channel, that's a blockchain transaction. You should do that in a Coinjoin. If you want to peg into a side chain, like Liquid, for example, that's a Coinjoin, and that's an on-chain transaction, and you should do it in a Coinjoin. Or same with eCash, or which are basically custodians, right? So whenever you deposit money into a custodian or withdraw your money from a custodian, that's a blockchain transaction and can be done in a Coinjoin. ARC is a bit different. It's kind of like an off-chain Coinjoin, which is a very novel and interesting idea, and shows what's possible with covenants, basically, something like check lock time verify. Check template verify. So there are, ultimately, I think Coinjoin collaborative Bitcoin transactions are extremely elegant solutions that use Bitcoin's natural anonymity and just make it useful. And it is extremely cheap compared to any other solution. Coin swaps, for example, is one interesting approach, and Chris Belcher has been working on this Bitcoin teleport project, and that, however, requires multiple transactions, time staggered, etc. So it's like on an order of 5 times, 10 times more expensive than a Coinjoin, providing arguably less privacy, right? So if you consider the trade-off of privacy, cost, and speed, and usability as kind of the cherry on top, Coinjoin is, in my opinion, still unbeaten. So I'm pretty sure that we will stick with Coinjoin for quite some time. I'm pretty sure that we will stick with centrally coordinated Coinjoins for quite some time. Decentralized Coinjoin coordination is still a totally unsolved problem, especially at scale. Then I think that Wasabi is the most sophisticated, most anonymous a Coinjoin coordination mechanism that we have. So there's still a lot of room for improvement within the Coinjoin realm. So despite it already being, let's say, the best available solution, we know a lot of ways of making it even better. And within the next couple of years, it's really going to shine. And I think it is a flexible and broad enough protocol to work really well with all the other things that we've built in Bitcoin since then and on top of it. So I think Coinjoins are here to stay, and they might have a much more resilient marketplace for discovering Coinjoin coordinators and for gathering liquidity into those Coinjoin transactions, etc. A join market has shown that this is possible and can be done elegantly since 2016. So and I think we just need a bit more research and development to, make it more robust and just unstoppable, basically. But those seem to be all solved problems. It's just about, getting the legwork of implementing it. But yeah, ultimately, I really think this is the way that a inefficient base money system like Bitcoin can be made anonymous without introducing extra costs or extra inefficiencies. And that would be really, really great. So I'm still hopeful for maybe we can get some changes to the Bitcoin protocol to make base layer anonymity better. I mean, if we would have, for example, confidential transactions, that would make things a lot cheaper, all things considered. Or ring signatures, not ring signatures, signature aggregation, for example, would also help in terms of efficiency. So numerous ways of changing the Bitcoin rules to make it even better. But it seems not much of that is required in terms of privacy. Lightning Network and vaulting constructions, etc., still need changes to the protocol in order for them to be long-term sustainable. Coinjoin, I think, does not. If we can change things, great. We know a couple ways of making it substantially better. But if we don't get there, yeah, it's all right. And I think that's okay. That's quite good. So I'm hopeful, and I think we have a bunch of people working on these problems now, and it is I'm hyper bullish on terms of Bitcoin privacy. Actually, in terms of Bitcoin scalability, still but privacy, if you have the money to pay for it, will not be an issue. I just hope we can make it cheaper and more accessible for people, but totally doable, I think. Yeah. Couple more years.
Well, Max, I should have known that we were going to chew up four hours or so on this call, because it's been so long since we've spoken. So maybe I should have broken it up from the get-go into two and invited you back, but I'll probably have to do that anyways, because it seems like there's so much going on in that space, and we've only really just scratched the surface on so many of the topics that we started on. So, but I just want to thank you. I know you've got a busy schedule. I really appreciate you making the time and sticking around for 2 hours longer than you had expected to. Always great to catch up and chat.
I expected long conversation. I mean, I would have been disappointed if you kicked me out after 2 hours.
Well, there you go. Yeah, if you were expecting just 2 hours, and I guess you wouldn't have. You shouldn't, as you say, with me, you should probably expect a long one. So I'm glad you set yourself up properly for this one today. But it's always great to catch up and chat. Been way too long. Love the work that you guys are doing. And any closing remarks or anything you want to touch on before we shut it down?
Keep building, guys out there. Seriously, and you don't need a developer to build. I still don't write a single line of code, but you can still be extremely useful to a bunch of different projects. And there are so many hills to die on, and I can't die on all of them. Neither can John. So division of labor is the way how we scale this. Become an educator, become a designer, become an architect, a builder, a philosopher, write books, do podcasts, write blogs, whatever it is that you do, but do it with passion and do it with principles, and do them first and foremost, and you will get better at doing them. And you'll stumble and make mistakes, and have doubts. And get quite pessimistic, but I hope for you that you find the spark of hope to keep going, because once you do, I can speak from experience on that point again. It's the adventure of a lifetime.
Good things happen.
Good things happen, absolutely. And yes, we might all unfortunately have to end up in the gulags, but it will be the biggest party, man. Just imagine a gulag full of Bitcoiners. It's like a never-ending Bitcoin conference, So it's in any outcome, it will be a blast.
You'll be surrounded by proof of work.
Exactly. Yeah. And the only thing they can take away from you is your reaction to any given situation. That's
Viktor Frankl.
Stay stoic and keep building, and try to stumble upwards in the right direction. That's I guess as much as we can hope for. And then while having fun, that's basically it, man.
Beautifully said, brother. Well, look, let's do this again soon. We can't wait so long in between. So I'll hit you up in a couple months, and maybe we'll get back together and catch up again then.
That will be great, man. Let's do it, my friend. Thanks again for the invite, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Take care.
Bye-bye.